Hello there, and welcome to Abyssal Zenith, where the ocean keeps its oldest stories folded beneath the surface, patient and unhurried, waiting for someone to ask the right question at the right hour of the night. We are asking one of those questions, and the answer, when it comes, is going to feel almost impossible to hold. Picture the South China Sea in the early 15th century. Not the way it looks on a satellite image, clean and blue and abstract, but the way it would have looked from a wooden deck in the summer of 1405. The water stretching in every direction, the horizon a long low line between heat and sky. And then, rising out of the haze, something that no sailor in the Western world would see for another 100 years, a fleet. Not a small fleet, not a modest collection of fishing boats or merchant vessels, a fleet so large that the people who witnessed it from shore must have stood very still for a moment, trying to count and eventually giving up. 37 Shen ships, 27,870 men. Vessels that were, by the measurements recorded in the Chinese imperial records of the time, roughly 137 meters long and 55 meters wide. To put that into some kind of scale that the mind can actually hold, Christopher Columbus's Santa Maria, the largest of his 3 ships when he crossed the Atlantic in 1492, was about 23 meters long. The treasure ships at the center of this Chinese fleet were nearly 6 times that length. 6 times. Santa Maria could have been parked on the deck of one of these ships and still left the room to walk around it. This was the fleet of Zheng He. And if you have never heard that name before, or if you have heard it only briefly in passing, that fact itself is part of the story. Because what happened on these voyages, what was seen, what was accomplished, and what was eventually done to the memory of it, it's one of the strangest chapters in all of recorded history. Before we go any further, I want to ask you something. Where are you listening from tonight? It is a genuine question. Are you somewhere near the sea, close enough that the air carries a little salt? Or are you inland, far from any water larger than a river, listening to this in a quiet room while the night settles around you? And what is the temperature where you are, I ask, because the story we are following tonight crossed oceans in every direction. From the warm, humid coasts of Southeast Asia to the windy shores of East Africa, from the shallow waters of the Strait of Malacca to the mouth of the Persian Gulf. Wherever you are right now, Zheng He's fleet passed through water not so different from some coast you might know. If this kind of story is what you come to at the end of a long day, I would be very grateful if you took a moment to like this video and subscribe to Abyssal Zenith. It is a small thing, but it genuinely helps this channel find more people who enjoy sitting quietly with a good story for a while. And we have a long one tonight, so make yourself comfortable. Now, back to the fleet. 317 ships. The number sounds almost invented. The kind of figure that belongs in a legend, rather than a historical record. But it comes from the Ming Shilu, the official veritable records of the Ming dynasty, from several other contemporary Chinese sources. The fleet was organized into a precise hierarchy of vessel types. At its center were the Baochuan, the treasure ships, the enormous flagships that carried the imperial gifts, the diplomatic envoys, and the admiral himself. Around them sailed horse ships, which transport horses and large cargo. Supply ships carried grain and provisions. Water tankers held fresh water for the crossing of open sea. Troop transports carried soldiers. Warships provided military escort, and smaller patrol boats moved around the edges of the formation. It was not just a fleet. It was a floating city, a mobile state, a self-contained civilization crossing the Indian Ocean. The man at the center of all of it was Zheng He. Here is where the story becomes something that novelists might hesitate to invent, because the details are almost too dramatic to feel real. Zheng He was a Muslim. He was a eunuch, been captured as a child during a military conquest, taken from his home in the mountains of southwestern China, castrated and brought into imperial service, grown up in the court of a prince who would later seize the Chinese throne through civil war, and he had risen through loyalty and capability, and the particular trust of a particular emperor to become the commander of the largest naval force in the history of the world up to that point. That is not a simplified version of the story. That is the story. We'll follow it carefully tonight, because every part of it matters. But first, it is worth sitting with the question of why almost nobody in the Western world knew about any of this for centuries. The voyages happened between 1405 and 1433. 7 expeditions spanning nearly 3 decades, covering tens of thousands of nautical miles. 30 nations sent tribute missions to the Ming court as a direct result of these voyages. Diplomats from Bengal, Hormuz, Aden, Malindi, and a dozen other places travelled to China, carrying gifts and formal acknowledgement of Ming power. Giraffes arrived in Nanjing from East Africa, living proof that the Chinese fleet had reached a continent that Europeans would not visit by sea for another 60 years. The voyages were enormous, consequential, and documented. And then they were, in a very deliberate way, forgotten. Not forgotten in the way things usually are, through neglect, through the passage of time, through the slow erosion of memory. Forgotten by policy. The records were suppressed, charts were burned, the ships were allowed to rot, and within a few generations, the voyages had been reduced to a rumour, a few stone inscriptions, a handful of official records that survived only because some bureaucrats, somewhere, had not been thorough enough. When European historians began to piece together what had happened, they found a gap in the historical record that was shaped exactly like a decision. Someone had chosen to make this disappear. That choice and the reasons behind it are as interesting as the voyages themselves. We will get to that. Tonight's story is long, and it moves slowly and carefully, the way a fleet of 300 ships moves through open water. There is no need to rush. What we are really talking about at its core is a civilization at the height of its power asking a question. The question was something like, what is out there? And the answer that came back over 7 voyages and nearly 30 years was more than you imagined. More kingdoms, more coastlines, more peoples, more animals, more goods, more worlds within the world than the maps had shown. China in the early 15th century was the most powerful state on Earth. Its capital, Nanjing, was one of the largest cities in the world. Its technology, its bureaucracy, its agricultural output, its military capacity were all extraordinary by any standard of the time, and it chose for a brief period to turn that power outward, to send it sailing across the Indian Ocean with silk banners and imperial gifts, and a Muslim admiral who'd been born a mountain boy in the province of Yunnan. The irony that Columbus, sailing 87 years later with 3 ships and about 90 men, is the name most of the world knows, while Zheng He, commanding a fleet that dwarfed anything Columbus could have imagined, remains largely unknown outside of East Asia and certain circles of historical scholarship. That irony is not accidental. It is the result of choices made by people who came after. Understanding those choices is part of understanding this story. But before we can understand any of that, we need to understand where Zheng He came from. Not just geographically, though that matters. We need to understand the world that made him, the dynasty that was just beginning to find its shape, the emperor who would become both his patron and his engine, the particular combination of ambition, politics, personal loyalty that turned a boy from Yunnan into the commander of the greatest fleet the world had ever seen. Because the voyages did not begin with ships. They began with a childhood interrupted by conquest, with a family torn apart by the advancing armies of a new dynasty, with a name that was not yet Zheng He but Ma He, a Muslim boy in the mountains of southwestern China watching the world he knew come apart at the edges. It is where we go next. Yunnan province in the 14th century was not the kind of place that appeared often in the grand narratives of Chinese imperial history. It sat in the far southwest, tucked against the edges of what is now Myanmar and Vietnam, a mountainous, forested region that had spent much of its existence operating at a comfortable distance from the political centers of China. Terrain made it difficult to reach and difficult to hold. It had its own character, its own cultures, its own ways of organizing life, and for a long time, great dynasties of the north had been content to leave it more or less alone. The family that Ma He was born into around 1371 was part of the Hui Muslim community, Chinese Muslims, whose presence in Yunnan stretched back centuries along the old trade routes connecting China to Central Asia and the Islamic world. His father was named Mir Tekin, and his grandfather had been named Charameddin. Both men had made the Hajj, the pilgrimage to Mecca, which in the 14th century was not a short or simple journey. From Yunnan to Mecca and back would have taken years, crossing deserts and mountain passes and open stretches of seas, passing through the Persian Gulf or along the Red Sea coast. The fact that both his father and grandfather had made this journey tells us something about the family. They were not casual in their faith. They were connected, however distantly, to a world that extended far beyond the mountains of Yunnan. They knew that there were other places, other peoples, other centers of civilization beyond the edges of what they could see from home. That knowledge, passed down through conversation and family memory, would matter later. But in 1381, Ma He was roughly 10 years old, and the world he knew was about to be taken apart. The dynasty that had ruled China for most of his short life was the Yuan dynasty, established by the Mongols under Kublai Khan in the 13th century. By the middle of the 14th century, the Yuan was struggling. A series of weak emperors, floods along the Yellow River, famine, plague, and a growing sequence of rebellions had worn the dynasty down to something fragile. The man who eventually pulled the empire together and replaced the Yuan was Zhu Yuanzhang, a former beggar and Buddhist novice who had risen through the chaos of rebellion to found the Ming dynasty in 1368. His reign name was the Hongwu Emperor, and he was by most accounts a man of intense and sometimes violent energy. He consolidated power rapidly, established a new capital at Nanjing, set about rebuilding the administrative and agricultural foundations of the empire. But Yunnan, in the far southwest, had not yet been brought into the Ming fold. The province was still held by Mongol-affiliated forces, the remnants of the Yuan presence in the region, and so, in 1381, the Hongwu Emperor sent an army to bring Yunnan to heel. The Ming general Fu Yud led a force of roughly 300,000 soldiers into the province, and the campaign was swift and decisive. The Mongol resistance collapsed. Yunnan was absorbed into the Ming Empire. The families who lived there, including Ma He's family, the conquest was not an abstraction. It was soldiers in the streets. It was the end of whatever arrangements had existed before, and for boys of a certain age, it meant something specific and terrible. The Ming forces, following a practice common in conquest of that era, captured young boys from the defeated population. Those boys were castrated and taken into imperial service as eunuchs. It was a way of neutralizing potential future threats, of taking sons from families who might otherwise grow into men with grievances. It was also, within the structure of the imperial court, a way of creating a class of servants who were entirely dependent on the emperor's favor, who had no families of their own to build, no sons to inherit, no outside loyalties to maintain. He was somewhere between 10 and 11 years old when he was captured. The details of exactly how and where are not recorded with precision. We know the fact of it, but not the texture. We do not know whether his father was present, whether he witnessed the capture, whether there was any resistance. What we know is that the boy from the Muslim family in Yunnan, father and grandfather had walked to Mecca, was taken from his home, surgically altered in a way that would define the rest of his life, and placed in the service of the imperial court. The psychological weight of this is worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy to read past it in the flow of historical narrative. He was a child. He had been living in a specific place, within a specific community, with a specific identity built around family and faith and the particular landscape of Yunnan. All of that was interrupted violently in a single campaign. He was taken to a world that was entirely different, a world of court protocols and imperial hierarchy, and the intricate, watchful politics of the Ming palace. He would have been surrounded by people who spoke different dialects, who practiced a different religion, who had no particular reason to be kind to a captive boy from the southwest. And yet, he survived, more than survived. He found his footing. The Ming eunuch system was not a simple institution. Eunuchs in the imperial court occupied a complicated position. On one hand, they were servants, subordinates, men who had been defined by their removal from ordinary life. On the other hand, proximity to power had its own logic. A eunuch who served a prince well could become genuinely important. A eunuch who was intelligent, capable, loyal, and useful could rise to positions of real authority within the palace structure. The system was not designed to reward them, but it did not prevent them from rising either. And Ma He, apparently, is the kind of person who rose at some point in the late 1380s or early 1390s. Ma He was assigned to the household of Zhu Di, one of the Hongwu Emperor's sons, who held the title of Prince of Yan. It was based in the north, near what is now Beijing. This assignment would turn out to be the defining relationship of Ma He's life. Zhu Di was not a quiet prince. He was ambitious, militarily capable, deeply interested in power. He commanded troops along the northern frontier, fighting against Mongol incursions. He was the kind of man who filled a room, and Ma He, in his service, seems to have become genuinely trusted, which, in the context of a prince's household, was no small thing. We do not have detailed records of their day-to-day relationship in these early years. We do not have letters or diaries. What we have are the later outcomes, the evidence of what the relationship produced. And what it produced eventually was one of the most consequential partnerships in Chinese imperial history. But before that could happen, there was a crisis, a civil war. And in that civil war, Ma He would find the moment that changed his name. When the Hongwu Emperor died in 1398, the throne passed not to one of his sons, but to his grandson Jian Wen, a young man of moderate temperament and reformist inclinations. Almost immediately began to reduce the power of the regional princes. For Zhu Di, the Prince of Yan, this was an existential threat. The Jianwen Emperor's reforms were clearly aimed at princes like him, and Zhu Di, being the kind of man he was, did not wait to see how far the reforms would go. In 1399 he launched a rebellion. It was called the Jingnan Campaign, and it would last 3 years. Ma He fought in this rebellion. He was not simply a household servant watching from the margins. He was present on the battlefield, and in 1400, at a place called Zhenglumba, near what is now Beijing, he distinguished himself in combat. Details of exactly what he did are not recorded in the kind of granular way a modern military historian would want, but the outcome is clear. After the battle, Zhu Di honored him, and the honor took a specific form. He gave Ma He a new surname, the surname Zheng, taken from the place name of the battle. From that point forward, Ma He was Zheng He Namum's matter. In the context of the Ming court, receiving a surname from a prince was not a casual gesture. It was a mark of recognition, of genuine regard, of the kind of bond that went beyond the ordinary relationship between a prince and a servant. Zheng He carried that name for the rest of his life. It is the name by which history knows him. 1402, Zhu Di's forces took Nanjing. The Jianwen Emperor disappeared, possibly burned in the palace fire, possibly escaped in disguise. Nobody knew for certain. Zhu Di took the throne and declared himself the Yongle Emperor, which means roughly the Emperor of Perpetual Happiness. He moved the capital north to Beijing, began the construction of the Forbidden City, launched military campaigns against the Mongols, and commissioned a massive encyclopedia. He was, by any measure, a man of extraordinary energy and ambition, and among all the things he set in motion, voyages were perhaps the most unusual. Zheng He's position in the new imperial structure was considerable. He was appointed Grand Director, one of the highest ranks available to a eunuch. He became the Yongle Emperor's most trusted operational commander for the maritime project. The reasons the Yongle Emperor wanted the voyages are layered, and historians have debated them carefully. Trade was part of it, but not in the way European maritime expansion would later be driven by profit. The Ming tributary system worked differently. Foreign rulers acknowledged the Chinese emperor as the center of the world order, sent gifts and envoys to his court, and in return received imperial recognition, gifts of silk and porcelain, access to Chinese goods. It was diplomacy dressed as commerce, power dressed as generosity. There was also a more personal motive. The Jianwen emperor had never been confirmed dead. Possibility that he had escaped, that he was somewhere out there, perhaps building support in Southeast Asia or beyond, was a genuine concern for the Yongle Emperor. Sending the fleet to visit foreign courts was also in part a way of checking, of making sure that no deposed emperor was being sheltered somewhere along the Indian Ocean rim. Whether this was a primary motive or a secondary one is hard to say, but it was real. And there was the question of legitimacy itself. The Yongle Emperor had taken the throne by force from his own nephew. It was not a comfortable origin story. The arrival of foreign envoys in Nanjing, bearing gifts and formal acknowledgements of his authority, was useful. It said, in the language of imperial symbolism, heaven approved of his rule, that rulers from distant lands had come to pay their respects, that the world recognized him. A giraffe from East Africa, as we will see later, would be pressed into service for exactly this kind of symbolic work. So, the voyages were not any single thing. They were a projection of power, a diplomatic network, a search for a missing emperor, a performance of legitimacy, a gathering of tribute, and perhaps, underneath all of it, a genuine curiosity about what lay beyond the horizon. The Yongle Emperor was the engine, but Zheng He was the instrument. The instrument had been shaped by everything that had happened to him since 1381. The boy from Yunnan, who had lost his home, his family's world, and his own body to a military conquest, had become, through a combination of circumstance and capability, and the particular loyalty that sometimes grows between people who have been through things together, the most powerful naval commander on Earth. It is worth noting what he brought to that role beyond military capability. He was Muslim, which meant that in the ports of the Persian Gulf and the Swahili coast and the Malabar coast of India, Islam was the dominant faith of merchants and rulers. He was not entirely a foreigner. He could speak to the religious world of those places in a way that a Han Chinese Buddhist admiral could not. He had grown up in a family that understood long journeys, that had made the pilgrimage to Mecca, that knew the Indian Ocean world existed and mattered. He spoke presumably some form of the Persian or Arabic that served as the trade languages of the region. He was, in a strange way, exactly the right person for this particular task, shaped by exactly the wrong circumstances into exactly the right instrument. The fleet that would carry him was still being built. Thousands of craftsmen were at work along the Qinhuai River near Nanjing. Timber was arriving from Fujian and Sichuan. The great shipyard at Longjiang was producing vessels unlike anything that had sailed before, and the boy who had been taken from Yunnan as a child was now a man in his 30s, standing somewhere in the organizational machinery of the most ambitious maritime project in human history, preparing to take it to sea. Exactly a captured child becomes the commander of 300 ships is a question that history answers only in fragments. But the fragments, placed carefully together, begin to form a shape. That shape is what we follow next, into the shipyard, into the construction of the fleet, and toward the first departure To understand how Zheng He came to hold that kind of authority, to understand the man who gave it to him. And to understand the Yongle Emperor, you have to go back a little further than 1402, back to the years when Zhu Di was still a prince, still one of several sons of the founding Hongwu Emperor, still stationed in the north at Beijing, governing a frontier region and commanding soldiers rather than courts. He was not the heir. Hongwu Emperor had designated his grandson, Zhu Yunwen, as the successor. When the old emperor died in 1398, Zhu Yunwen took the throne and became the Jianwen Emperor. He was young, bookish, inclined toward Confucian governance, and surrounded by advisors who were nervous about the power held by the regional princes. So, he began a policy of reducing their authority, stripping titles, reassigning territories, and in some cases forcing princes into exile or death. Zhu Di watched this happen to his brothers one by one. He was next. What followed was a civil war that lasted from 1399 to 1402, 3 years of campaigns across northern and central China. It was called the Jingnan Campaign, sometimes translated as the Campaign for the Pacification of the Realm, which is the kind of name that the winner gets to choose. Zhu Di's forces were experienced soldiers, hardened by years of frontier warfare against the Mongols. The Jianwen Emperor's forces were larger, but less unified, and the court around him made military decisions with the hesitation that tends to come from people who have read more about war than they have practiced it. Zheng He, then still Ma He, fought in this campaign. He was a military commander in Zhu Di's household, and he proved himself in the field. The specific engagement at Zhenglumba in 1400 is where the historical record notes his contribution. Details of what exactly happened there are not fully preserved, but the outcome's clear enough. Zhu Di recognized the service. After taking Nanjing in 1402, after the palace fire and the disappearance of the Jianwen Emperor, after Zhu Di declared himself the Yongle Emperor, and began reorganizing the empire according to his own very considerable vision, he gave his loyal commander a new name, Zheng, from the place where the battle had been fought. It was a specific, deliberate act of acknowledgement. In a court structured around hierarchy and symbolism, where names and titles carried weight, this was not a small thing. There is something worth pausing on here, though it is easy to pass over it quickly. Zheng He was a eunuch, been castrated as a boy, as a consequence of being captured during a military campaign. In the Ming court, eunuchs occupied a particular and somewhat complicated position. They could not hold the traditional civil service offices that the Confucian scholar officials held. They were, in a sense, outside the normal structure of power. But for exactly that reason, they could be trusted with a different kind of power. They had no family lineages to protect, no hereditary ambitions, no sons who might one day challenge the throne. Their loyalty, when it was secured, was total. The Yongle Emperor understood this. He relied on eunuchs for sensitive and important tasks throughout his reign, and Zheng He was the most significant example of that reliance. The Grand Director title that Zheng He received was not ceremonial. It placed him at the head of the entire maritime enterprise, with authority over the fleet, the officers, the troops, the diplomats, the translators, the medical staff, and the logistics chain that would keep tens of thousands of men alive across months at sea. That is an enormous amount of operational responsibility. The Yongle Emperor gave it to a man he had known personally for years, a man who had fought beside him, a man whose capabilities he had observed directly. The political context around the Voyages is worth sitting with for a moment, because it shapes everything that followed. When the Yongle Emperor took the throne, he did so in circumstances that were, to put it plainly, awkward. He had overthrown his nephew. He had done so by force. The Confucian framework that governed imperial legitimacy held that the emperor ruled with the mandate of heaven. That mandate was supposed to pass in an orderly way. A civil war, a palace fire, and an uncle on the throne of his nephew was not the orderly version. The uncle emperor spent a great deal of energy during his reign managing this problem. He commissioned enormous projects. He moved the capital, an act that reorganized the geography of imperial power. He launched military campaigns that brought new territories under Ming authority. He ordered the compilation of the Yongle-Dadian, an encyclopedia so vast that it ran to nearly 23,000 volumes. These were all in part performances of legitimate imperial authority. A ruler who builds the Forbidden City, who defeats the Mongols, who gathers the knowledge of the world into a single collection, making an argument about his right to rule. The Voyages fit into this pattern. Foreign rulers arriving in Nanjing with gifts and formal acknowledgements of his authority were pieces of evidence presented to the court and to history that heaven approved of this emperor. The world recognized him, that the usurpation, if anyone was still thinking of it that way, had been ratified by the weight of diplomatic reality. Then there was the specific, persistent problem of the genuine emperor. The palace fire had been real, bodies had been found, but the genuine emperor's body had not been identified with certainty. Rumors circulated that he had escaped in disguise, perhaps as a Buddhist monk, perhaps traveling through the south, perhaps sheltering in Southeast Asia or beyond. These rumors were probably false. Most historians today think the Jianwen emperor died in the fire or shortly after. But the Yongle emperor could not be certain. Uncertainty of that kind is exactly the sort of thing that can quietly destabilize a reign. If a deposed emperor was alive somewhere, being sheltered by a foreign ruler who was waiting for an opportunity, it was a genuine political threat. The Voyages allowed the fleet to visit courts across Southeast Asia, South Asia, and the Persian Gulf to establish relationships with local rulers, to make the presence of Ming power felt, and to look quietly for any sign that the missing emperor had found refuge. There is no record that Zheng He ever found anything, but the looking was part of the mission. What is interesting is that even without the political motivations, the Voyages would have made a certain kind of sense. The Indian Ocean had been a functioning trade world for centuries before Zheng He arrived. Arab, Persian, Indian, Malay and East African merchants had been moving spices, silk, ivory and porcelain along its routes for generations. China had been part of that world, but at a distance, through intermediaries, through private merchants, who operated outside official channels. The Yongle Emperor's voyages were in one sense the state stepping directly into a commercial and diplomatic world that had previously been managed informally. By sending the imperial fleet, he was asserting that China's engagement with the Indian Ocean would happen on China's terms, under the tribute system, with the emperor at the center of the exchange. This was a different model than what European maritime expansion would later produce. The Portuguese, the Spanish, the Dutch, the English, they went looking for profit, for monopolies, for colonies, control of trade routes in a commercial sense. The Yongle Emperor was looking for acknowledgement, for tribute, for the performance of a world order in which China was the center. The goods that came back mattered. They mattered partly as symbols of that acknowledgement, not primarily as commodities to be sold for profit. Zheng He understood this framework and operated within it with considerable skill. He was not simply a military commander. He was a diplomat, a negotiator, a man who could read a foreign court and determine what combination of gifts, ceremonies, and implicit threats would produce the desired result. The fleet he commanded was large enough to be unmistakably powerful. It did not need to fight in most places. Its size was the argument. When 60 or 70 ships appeared in a harbour, flying imperial banners, carrying thousands of soldiers alongside their silks and porcelain, the message was clear without anyone needing to say it aloud. The question of whether to cooperate with the Ming tribute system had a fairly obvious answer when the alternative was visible on the water. But Zheng He was also, by multiple accounts, genuinely interested in the places he visited. The records that survive from the voyages, and there are not as many as historians would like, suggest a real attention to the details of foreign lands. It's the interpreter Ma Huan, who travelled with the fleet, wrote a book called the Yingya Shenglan, or the Overall Survey of the Ocean Shores, which recorded observations about the peoples, customs, products, and landscapes of the places they visited. Fei Xin, another traveller with the fleet, wrote the Xingsha Shenglan, or the Overall Survey of the Star Raft. These are not dry administrative documents, are records of genuine curiosity, descriptions of things seen and tasted and heard. The people of Java, the markets of Calicut, the strange animals of the African coast. The voyages generated knowledge. Some of that knowledge was preserved even after so much else was lost. The relationship between Zheng He and the Yongle Emperor is not something the historical record describes in personal terms. We do not have letters between them or accounts of private conversations or the kind of intimate documentation that would let us say with confidence what they thought of each other as individuals. What we have is the record of what the emperor authorized and what Zheng He accomplished. And that record suggests something more than a simple command relationship. The emperor gave Zheng He enormous resources and enormous trust again and again across 7 voyages. Zheng He delivered results that served the emperor's political needs and expanded the Ming world in ways that no one before had attempted. Between 2 people who had been through a civil war together and had fought on the same side when the outcome was genuinely uncertain, that kind of professional relationship tends to carry a weight that does not need to be written down. By the time the first voyage was being organized in 1404 and 1405, Zheng He was probably in his early 30s. He had been in Zhu Di's service for most of his adult life. He had fought, he had administered, built the kind of reputation that results in a prince giving you his own surname. And now the emperor was giving him something else entirely. 300 ships, nearly 28,000 men, and the Indian Ocean. The construction of that fleet was already underway. The Longjiang shipyard on the Qinhuai River near Nanjing was one of the largest industrial operations in the world. At that moment, timber was coming in from the forests of Fujian and Sichuan. Craftsmen were working in numbers that are difficult to picture. The ships being built there were unlike anything that had ever been put to sea. What those ships looked like, how they were built, what it actually took to construct and supply a fleet of that scale is where the story goes next. Longjiang shipyard sat on the western bank of the Qinhuai River, a few miles from the heart of Nanjing, and by the early years of the 15th century, it had become something that defied easy description. It was not simply a place where ships were built. It was a city within a city, a vast complex of dry docks, warehouses, timber yards, rope walks, sail lofts, workshops that stretched along the riverbank for what contemporary sources describe as several a Chinese unit of distance that translates to roughly half a kilometer each. Multiple dry docks were dug into the bank, large enough to hold vessels of a size that most people in the world at that time had never seen and could barely have imagined. The river connected to the Yangtze connected to the sea. The geography was deliberate. Everything that needed to come in and everything that needed to go out had a clear path. The timber came first. The quantities involved were staggering. Fujian province, on the southeastern coast, supplied much of the hardwood. Sichuan, in the interior, sent timber down the Yangtze. The specific woods mattered. Different parts of a ship required different properties. Teak and camphor wood were prized for their resistance to rot and to the boring worms that could destroy a hull in tropical waters. The great structural timbers needed to be long and straight, which meant finding trees of the right size in the right forests, and then figuring out how to move them, sometimes hundreds of miles before the actual construction could begin. The logistics of the timber supply alone would have been a significant administrative challenge. The fact that it was solved repeatedly across multiple rounds of shipbuilding says something about the organizational capacity of the early Ming state. The ships built at Longjiang were classified by type, and there were several types. The largest were the Baochuan, the treasure ships. They are the ones that still stop people in their tracks when they encounter the recorded dimensions. Contemporary Chinese sources give the largest Baochuan a length of roughly 444 chi, which translates to approximately 137 meters, with a beam of about 180 zhang, roughly 55 meters wide. Some accounts suggest even larger figures. There is debate among historians and maritime archaeologists about whether these numbers are entirely accurate, whether they represent the largest vessels ever built, whether the figures were somewhat exaggerated in the records. But even if the actual ships were somewhat smaller than the maximum figures suggest, they were still enormous by any standard of the time. The Santa Maria, the largest of Columbus's 3 ships when he crossed the Atlantic in 1492, was roughly 19 meters long. The smallest credible estimate for a Baochuan puts it at several times that length. The largest estimates put it at more than 7 times. Either way, the scale difference is not a matter of degree. It is a different category of object. 9 masts rose from the deck of a fully rigged treasure ship. The sails were made of red silk, or in some accounts, a kind of woven matting that could be adjusted in sections, allowing the crew to manage the sail area in different wind conditions without the enormous effort required by a single large sail. This was a sophisticated system. European square-rigged ships of the same period were powerful in a following wind, but difficult to sail close to the wind. The Chinese batten sail, stiffened with horizontal bamboo rods, could be angled more efficiently and adjusted more quickly, which gave the treasure ships a degree of maneuverability that their size would not otherwise suggest. The sails were one of the things that made the fleet capable of operating across the varied wind conditions of the Indian Ocean. Where the monsoon reverses directions seasonally, a voyage has to be planned around that reversal. Below the waterline, the Baochuan had a feature that Chinese shipbuilders had been developing for centuries, that European shipbuilders would not widely adopt for several hundred years more. The hull was divided into watertight compartments by internal bulkheads, transverse walls that ran across the width of the ship and sealed each section from the others. If the hull was breached in one location, the flooding was contained. The ship would not immediately sink. This was not a minor engineering detail, it was a fundamental safety advantage, one that made long ocean voyages in unknown waters considerably less catastrophic when things went wrong, as they inevitably did. Marco Polo had noticed this feature in Chinese ships during his travels in the late 13th century and described it with evident admiration. By Zheng He's time, it was standard practice in Chinese ocean-going vessels. The rest of the world would take a very long time to catch up. Treasure ships were the prestige vessels, the ones carrying the silks, porcelain, the imperial gifts, and the diplomatic officials who would conduct the formal ceremonies of the tribute system in foreign ports. But the fleet that accompanied them was far more than a collection of large showpieces. A full treasure fleet voyage included several other categories of ship, each serving a specific function. The Majuan, or horse ships, were slightly smaller than the Baochuan and were used to carry horses, both as gifts for foreign rulers and as mounts for the cavalry troops travelling with the fleet. They were roughly 103 meters long, still large vessels by any comparison. The Liangchuan, or grain ships, carried the food supplies that would keep 27,000 men fed across voyages that could last 2 years or more. The Zuochuan, or troop transport, carried soldiers. The Zhanchuan, or warships, were the armed escort, faster and more maneuverable than the treasure ships, designed to respond quickly to threats. and there were water tankers carrying fresh water for the fleet's daily needs, because finding reliable fresh water sources along the route was never guaranteed, and a fleet of this size consumed enormous quantities every day. The number of vessels in the first voyage is recorded as 317, though some sources give slightly different figures. Across 7 voyages, the composition of the fleet varied. Some voyages were larger, some smaller. Some were led personally by Zheng He, others by subordinate commanders, while Zheng He remained in Nanjing. But the first voyage, departing in 1405, by most accounts the largest single fleet operation in the history of that era, and possibly in the history of any era up to that point, organizing 317 ships to depart in coordination, to maintain formation across thousands of miles of open water, to arrive at foreign ports in a way that communicated power rather than chaos. It required a level of logistical and navigational skill that is easy to underestimate from a distance. Back at the Longjiang shipyard, the human workforce was as remarkable as the timber and the engineering. Craftsmen of every relevant specialty were assembled there: shipwrights, caulkers, sailmakers, rope makers, blacksmiths, carpenters, painters, and the workers who operated the dry docks themselves. Dry docks at Longjiang were not small. Excavations conducted in the 20th century at the site, which is now a museum on the edge of modern Nanjing, uncovered physical evidence of the scale of the operation. Most striking single artifact found there is a wooden rudder post, recovered from the mud of the old dock area. It measures approximately 11 meters in length. The rudder post is the vertical timber to which the steering rudder is attached, and its size is directly related to the size of the ship it served. An 11 rudder post is consistent with a vessel of Baochuan scale. It is one of the few pieces of physical evidence that gives a direct, tangible sense of what these ships actually were, not as numbers on a page, but as objects in the world, things made of wood and iron and rope that once existed in 3 dimensions and moved through real water. The organizational complexity of building the fleet was in some ways as impressive as the ships themselves. The Ming state had to coordinate the timber supply from multiple distant provinces, the movement of skilled workers to a single location, the manufacturing of sails and rigging and anchors and navigational instruments, provisioning of food and water and medicine for the voyages, and the construction of the dry docks themselves before any of the ships could even be started. All of this happened under the oversight of the Yongle Emperor's administration, with Zheng He playing a central role in the planning and execution. The emperor's commitment to the project was total. Critics at court raised concerns about the cost, and there were critics even in those early years. The emperor overrode them. The fleet would be built. The voyages would happen. Resources of one of the wealthiest states in the world would be directed toward this purpose for as long as the emperor wished it. There is something worth pausing on here, which is the question of what the people working at the Longjiang shipyard actually understood about what they were building toward. A carpenter fitting bulkheads into a hull, a sailmaker measuring red silk against a batten, a worker driving caulking into the seams between planks. These people were doing technical work that they had been trained to do. Whether they had any sense of the larger vision, whether the news of where these ships were going and why it filtered down to the craftsman's level, is not something the records tell us. What we know is that the work was done, and done well enough, that the fleet sailed across the Indian Ocean and back multiple times, carrying thousands of people through conditions that tested everything about the ship's construction. Hulls held. The bulkheads did their job. The masts carried their sails through monsoon winds and open ocean swells. Whatever the craftsmen of Longjiang understood or did not understand about the larger purpose, they built things that worked. One more element of the fleet. Half the fleet is worth describing before the ships leave the harbour, because it is easy to think of the treasure fleet purely in terms of its military and diplomatic functions, and to miss something else it carried. The voyages included physicians who treated the sick among the crew and also gathered medical knowledge from the places they visited. They included astronomers and navigators who used the compass, star charts, and depth soundings to track position across open water. They included interpreters, the most important of whom was Ma Huan, a Chinese Muslim who spoke Arabic and Malay, and who would later write the Yingya Shenglan of the few surviving first-hand accounts of what the voyagers actually encountered. The fleet was not only a military and diplomatic instrument, it was in a real sense a floating institution, carrying specialists whose job was to observe, record, communicate, and understand. The knowledge the voyagers generated was one of their most significant products, even if much of it was later lost. By the summer of 1405, the first fleet was ready. The ships had been provisioned, the crews had been assembled, the diplomatic instructions had been issued. Zheng He, now in his mid-30s, held his appointment as Grand Director and commander of the expedition. The Yongle Emperor had given him everything he needed. What happened next? The actual departure, first long arc southward through the South China Sea, and the first real test of whether all this construction and planning would produce the results the Emperor wanted, was about to begin. The fleet departed in the summer of 1405. The precise date most commonly cited is the 7th month of that year by the Chinese calendar, which places the departure somewhere around late July or early August. The launching point was Liujiagang, near the mouth of the Yangtze River, in what is now Jiangsu province, though the fleet had also assembled at Suzhou before making its way to the coast. Standing on the shore and watching 317 ships move out through the estuary and into open water would have been an experience that defied easy description. The sound alone, the creak of timber, snap of silk sails catching wind, the calls of sailors relaying orders from deck to deck across hundreds of vessels, must have carried for miles. For the people watching from the riverbanks in the coastal towns, this was not an abstraction. This was a physical event on a scale that had no precedent in their experience or in anyone's memory. The route Zheng He followed on this first voyage was not a blind reach into the unknown. Chinese merchants and sailors had been moving through the South China Sea and into the waters of Southeast Asia for centuries before the treasure fleet was built. The coastal trade routes, the monsoon patterns, the locations of ports and fresh water and anchorages, all of this was known to experienced navigators. What was different about the treasure fleet was not the direction it sailed, but the scale of what was sailing it, and the political purpose behind the journey. This was not a trading expedition in the ordinary sense. It was a statement. Every foreign ruler who watched those ships arrive in his harbour was meant to understand something about the nature of Ming China and the reach of the Yongle Emperor's authority. The first stops followed the coast of Southeast Asia southward. The fleet touched at Champa, which occupied the central and southern coast of what is now Vietnam. From there, it moved to the island of Java. The ports of the north coast had long been part of the Indian Ocean trading network. Then to Malacca, the small but strategically placed port on the Malay Peninsula that sat at the narrowest point of the strait between the peninsula and Sumatra. Malacca, in 1405, was a relatively new settlement, founded around 1400 by a Malay prince named Paramaswara, and it was already becoming clear that its location made it one of the most important trading points in the eastern half of the Indian Ocean world. Zheng He's visit, and the diplomatic recognition that came with it, would help establish Malacca as a formal tributary state of Ming China, a relationship that gave the port protection and legitimacy and helped it grow into the major entrepot it would become over the following decades. But the most significant event of the first voyage did not happen at Malacca or Java. It happened at Palembang on the eastern coast of Sumatra in the old territory of the Srivijayan Empire, which had once controlled much of the maritime trade of the region, but had, by this point, largely collapsed. Palembang was home to a large and established community of overseas Chinese, and it was also at this particular moment controlled by a man named Chen Zui. Chen Zui was by most accounts a pirate warlord and established himself at Palembang as a kind of independent power, extracting tolls and levies from the shipping that passed through the area, and was known for attacking vessels that refused to pay. The operation was well organized enough to have lasted for years. Chinese accounts describe him as a figure who had terrorized the sea lanes and who had accumulated considerable wealth and armed followers through his activities. He was, in other words, exactly the sort of person whose existence was incompatible with the kind of orderly tribute system the Yongle Emperor was trying to establish across the maritime world. When Zheng He arrived at Palembang, the situation required careful handling. There was already a local Chinese community leader named Shi Jinping, who had been cooperating with the Ming authorities, and who, according to the accounts, had warned Zheng He that Chen Zuyi was planning to feign submission while preparing a surprise attack on the fleet. What happened next is recorded in the Ming sources, though, as with many events from this period, details carry the inevitable weight of official narrative. According to these accounts, Chen Zuyi did indeed pretend to negotiate while organizing an assault. Zheng He's forces were prepared. When the attack came, the fleet responded with overwhelming force. The battle at Palembang was brief and decisive. Chen Zuyi's forces were routed. The Chinese sources say that more than 5,000 of his men were killed, 17 of his ships were burned, and 10 were captured. Chen Zuyi himself was taken alive. He was transported back to Nanjing, where he was presented to the Yongle Emperor as a trophy of the voyage's success and subsequently executed. The manner of his execution was likely public and formal, designed to serve as a demonstration of the consequences of resisting Ming authority. This episode established something important about the nature of the treasure fleet that is worth sitting with for a moment. The ships carried silk and porcelain and gifts for foreign rulers. They carried interpreters and physicians and astronomers. They carried the formal language of tributary diplomacy and the soft power of imperial generosity. But they also carried soldiers and weapons, and the capacity for organized military violence on a very large scale. The tribute system the Voyages promoted was not purely voluntary. Cooperation was encouraged through gifts and recognition, and the considerable prestige of being acknowledged by the Ming court. Non-cooperation or active resistance was met with force. Chen Zuyi's fate was not incidental. It was instructive. The rest of the first voyage continued westward and northward across the Indian Ocean. The fleet reached the Malabar coast of southern India, stopping at Calicut, which the Chinese called Guli. Calicut was one of the most important spice trading ports in the world at that time, a city whose merchants connected the pepper and cardamom of the Kerala coast with buyers from Arabia, Persia, East Africa and beyond. The ruler of Calicut, the Zamorin, had received Zheng He's embassy and engaged in the formal exchange of gifts that was the diplomatic currency of the tribute system. This was not a negotiation between equals in the Chinese conception of the relationship. The Zamorin was expected to acknowledge the superiority of the Ming Emperor and to send tribute missions to Nanjing. In return, he received gifts, trade access, the protection that came with being recognized as a friend of the largest state in the world. The fleet turned back toward China sometime in 1406, and it arrived home in 1407. It came something that would become a defining feature of the voyages as they continued. Foreign envoys, rulers, and their representatives from multiple ports and kingdoms had agreed to travel to Nanjing to pay formal tribute to the Yongle Emperor. This was the political result the Emperor had wanted. The voyagers were not about reaching distant places. They were about bringing those distant places. Into a formal relationship with the Ming court, about making the world acknowledge the center. The return of the fleet was an occasion for ceremony. The foreign envoys were received at the imperial court with elaborate ritual. The gifts they brought, the exotic goods, the animals, the products of distant lands, were presented before the emperor as evidence of his universal authority, and Chen Zuyi, the pirate of Palembang, was executed in public view, completing the demonstration. The message of the first voyage was clear enough. The Ming fleet could reach you, reward you if you cooperated, and destroy you if you did not. It is easy to miss, when looking at the first voyage, purely in terms of its dramatic events, is the quieter work it accomplished. Fleet's passage through the South China Sea and across the Indian Ocean was also a process of observation and documentation. Ma Huan, the Arabic-speaking interpreter who sailed on multiple voyages and later wrote his account of what he saw, was already gathering the kind of detailed information about foreign ports, customs, trade goods, peoples that would make his Yingya Shenglan a valuable record. The navigators were taking depth soundings, noting currents, recording landmarks and star positions. Physicians were observing local medicinal plants and practices. This accumulation of knowledge was not incidental to the voyages. It was part of their purpose, even if it has received less attention than the battles and the tribute ceremonies. There is also something worth noting about the sheer physical extent of this first voyage for the men aboard the ships. The monsoon system that governs the Indian Ocean is not a gentle or predictable thing. It is a seasonal reversal of winds on a massive scale, and while experienced navigators could work with it, using the southwest monsoon to push westward and the northeast monsoon to return, the crossing of the open ocean was still a serious undertaking. Ships could be separated by storms. Illness was a constant threat. The fleet carried medical supplies and physicians, but the conditions aboard a wooden sailing vessel, carrying thousands of men across thousands of miles of open water, were difficult in ways that are hard to fully appreciate from a comfortable distance. Fresh water had to be carefully rationed. Food spoiled. Men got sick. The sheer duration of the voyage, roughly 2 years from departure to return, meant that the crew endured a sustained period of physical hardship that no amount of organizational excellence could fully eliminate. And yet the fleet returned. It returned with its mission accomplished, with foreign envoys in tow, with a pirate warlord in chains, and with the first proof that the Yongle Emperor's enormous investment in the treasure fleet had produced the results he had intended. The tribute system worked. The diplomatic model worked. The ships worked. The pattern established by the first voyage would repeat with variations across the voyages that followed. The fleet would arrive at a foreign port. Gifts would be exchanged. The local ruler would be invited, sometimes firmly, to send tribute to Nanjing. If cooperation was offered, it was rewarded. If resistance was offered, it was overcome. The foreign envoys who made the journey to the Ming court would be received with ceremony and sent home with gifts that made the cost of the voyage worthwhile from their perspective. The whole system was designed to project a particular image of the Ming Empire: vast, generous, powerful, and impossible to ignore. What made the first voyage significant was not just what it accomplished, but what it demonstrated was possible. A fleet of this size could be built, supplied, launched, and brought home successfully. The logistical model worked at scale. The navigational knowledge was sufficient. Political results were achievable. The Yongle Emperor now had proof that his investment had been worthwhile, and he had every reason to send the fleet out again. And he did. The second voyage departed in 1407, the same year the first returned. The third followed in 1409. The destinations expanded. The diplomatic network grew wider. The voyages would push farther west, deeper into the Indian Ocean, toward India's Malabar coast, and beyond. toward waters that would eventually bring the fleet to the Persian Gulf and the shores of East Africa. Each voyage built on the one before it, extending the reach of the tribute system and the geographic knowledge of the Ming court. The first voyage had established what was possible. Voyages that followed would find out how far that possibilities could actually reach. The second voyage departed in the same year the first returned, which tells you something about the Yongle Emperor's appetite for this project. There was no long pause, no extended period of review and deliberation. The results of the first voyage had satisfied him, and the machinery of the treasure fleet was already in motion. In practical terms, it made sense to send the ships out again before the men and the organizational knowledge dispersed. Keeping a fleet of this complexity operational required continuity. The moment you stopped, skills began to scatter. What is less certain about the second voyage, which ran from 1407 to 1409, is whether Zheng He personally led it. Some historical accounts suggest he remained in China during at least part of this period, possibly overseeing matters at the Nanjing court, and that the fleet was commanded primarily by Wang Jinghong of his senior deputies. The records from this period are incomplete enough that historians have debated the question without fully resolving it. What seems clear is that the second voyage followed the general pattern of the first, visiting many of the same ports along the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean, consolidating the diplomatic relationships the first voyage had established, and returning foreign envoys to their home ports after their ceremonial visit to the Ming court. It was a voyage of maintenance more than discovery, which does not make it unimportant. Maintaining a diplomatic network across 12,000 miles of open ocean required its own kind of effort. The third voyage, which departed in 1409 and returned in 1411, was personally led by Zheng He, and it pushed the operation further in both geographic and political terms. The fleet again visited Calicut on India's Malabar coast, which had become a central node in the tribute network. Calicut, known today as Kozhikode, was at that time one of the most important trading ports in the Indian Ocean world. It sat at the western edge of the subcontinent, positioned to receive goods coming across from Arabia and East Africa, and to send out the pepper and other spices that grew in the hills behind the coast. The Zamorin, ruler of Calicut, had already established a working relationship with the Ming fleet after the first voyage, and the third voyage deepened that connection. The fleet arrived with gifts, conducted its ceremonies of exchange, and reinforced the formal acknowledgement that Calicut was part of the Ming tributary network. Ma Huan, the interpreter and chronicler, who sailed on multiple voyages, wrote about Calicut in some detail in his Yingya Shenglan. He described the city's markets, the variety of goods available, the local customs around trade, the food, the people, the weights and measures used by the merchants. His account gives a texture to the place that official records rarely provide. He noted that the people of Calicut were skilled traders who maintained their own detailed accounting systems, that the market was organized and well regulated, that transactions between foreign merchants and local traders were conducted with a formality that both sides respected. Reading his description, you get the sense of a busy, sophisticated commercial city that had been managing international trade for generations before the Ming fleet arrived, and would continue doing so long after it left. The fleet was a powerful presence, but Calicut was not a passive recipient of its attention. It was a place with its own interests and its own way of operating. But it was not Calicut that produced the most dramatic episode of the third voyage. It happened in Ceylon, the island known today as Sri Lanka, which the fleet passed on its route across the Indian Ocean. Ceylon had been a stop on the first voyage as well. The relationship with its rulers had not been entirely smooth. On the third voyage, the situation deteriorated into open conflict. The ruler the fleet encountered, was a king named Alagakanara, who governed a portion of the island, and who was, by the accounts that survive, deeply hostile to the Ming fleet's presence and to the tributary demands it brought with it. The exact details of what provoked the confrontation are not entirely clear from the surviving records, but what happened next is documented. Alagakanara launched an attack. Some accounts say he attempted to lure Zheng He's forces into a trap, cutting them off from their ships, while his own forces moved to seize the fleet. Other accounts describe a more direct military engagement. It is consistent across the sources is the outcome. Zheng He's forces fought back, and they did so with a decisiveness that must have surprised anyone who thought the fleet's enormous size made it slow or cautious. A detachment of Ming troops, reportedly around 2,000 men, moved directly on Alagakanara's capital. They captured the king, his family, and a number of his officials. The whole operation was swift enough that it succeeded before the larger Ceylonese forces could respond effectively. Alagakanara and his family were placed aboard the fleet and transported back to Nanjing. The journey from Ceylon to Nanjing was not a short one. It would have taken months. Whatever the experience of that passage was for Alagakanara, it ended at the Ming imperial court. He was brought before the Yongle emperor. And here the outcome took a turn that might seem surprising. He was not executed. The Ming court decided to release him. The Yongle emperor, having made his point about the consequences of defying the tribute system, chose clemency. Alagakanara was sent home, and a different ruler, one more willing to cooperate with the Ming framework, was installed in his place, with the court's backing. This decision is worth thinking about for a moment, because it reveals something about the logic of the tribute system that is easy to miss if you focus only on the fleet's military power. The point was never conquest in the European colonial sense. The Ming court was not trying to administer Ceylon directly, extract its resources through a colonial apparatus, or settle Chinese populations there. What it wanted was acknowledgement, the formal recognition that the Ming emperor sat at the top of a universal hierarchy, and that foreign rulers derived their legitimacy, at least in a ceremonial sense, his recognition of them. Executing Alagakanara would have been a demonstration of power, but releasing him and installing a cooperative ruler was a demonstration of something more useful. The system offered a way out as well as a way in. Submit, and you would be treated well. Resist, and you would be removed. But removal did not have to mean death. It meant replacement with someone who understood the arrangement. The third voyage returned to China in 1411, with Alagakanara and his family, with the usual collection of foreign envoys, with goods and observations gathered across the Indian Ocean. It had demonstrated more clearly than the first two voyages that the fleet was not merely a diplomatic mission. It had genuine military capability and the willingness to use it when the situation required. But it had also shown that the military capability was in service of a diplomatic goal, not an end in itself. The fleet could fight, it preferred not to, and when it did fight, the result was not occupation but adjustment, a recalibration of the local political situation to produce a more cooperative outcome. This dual nature of the fleet, its combination of overwhelming force and deliberate restraint, was not accidental. It reflected a coherent strategic vision, one that the Yongle Emperor and Zheng He appear to have shared. The treasure fleet was an instrument of what we might now call soft power, backed by hard power sufficient to make the soft power credible. The gifts it brought were genuine expressions of Ming wealth and generosity. The ceremonies it conducted were genuine expressions of a world view that placed the Ming emperor at the center of a civilized order. But behind all of it was the unspoken knowledge that the fleet could, if necessary, do what it had done in Palembang to Chenzuyi and in Ceylon to Alagakanara. The combination was what made the system work. It is also worth pausing on the sheer geographic range that the fleet had now demonstrated it could operate across. The route from Nanjing to Ceylon and Calicut covered something in the range of 5 to 6,000 nautical miles one way. The fleet was doing this with wooden ships, monsoon winds, magnetic compasses, and star charts. The navigators did not have longitude in any precise sense. They had accumulated generations of knowledge about the Indian Ocean's seasonal wind patterns, its currents, its hazards, and its ports. The compass had been in use in Chinese navigation since at least the 11th century, and by Zheng He's time it was a standard tool. Depth soundings were taken regularly, both to avoid shallow water and to help identify position when landmarks were visible. The star charts used by the fleet's navigators plotted the altitude of key stars above the horizon at different latitudes, allowing them to track their north-south position with reasonable accuracy. None of this was primitive. It was a sophisticated navigational tradition built up over centuries of maritime activity across the South China Sea and the Indian Ocean. The men who sailed on these voyages came from different parts of that tradition. Some were from Fujian province, which had a long history of maritime commerce, whose people had been sailing to Southeast Asia and beyond for generations. Some were from the Muslim communities of southeastern China, who had their own connections to the Arab and Persian maritime networks that had been operating across the Indian Ocean long before the Ming fleet arrived. Ma Huan himself was a Muslim, which was one reason he was valuable as an interpreter in ports where Arabic was spoken or understood. The fleet was, in this sense, a gathering of different kinds of maritime knowledge, organized and directed by the imperial state, but drawing on traditions that were older and wider than any single institution. After the third voyage, pattern was established well enough that the basic structure of what the fleet did and how it did it was no longer being invented as it went. The ports were known, the diplomatic protocols were understood, monsoon calendar dictated the timing of departures and returns. What the subsequent voyages would do was extend the range, push the network further west and south, test whether the tribute system could be made to work at distances that would have seemed almost incomprehensible from the vantage point of 1405. The fourth voyage, which departed in 1413 and returned in 1415, take the fleet further than it had gone before, past the Indian subcontinent, past the familiar ports of the Malabar coast, and into the Persian Gulf. It would bring the fleet to Hormuz, a strategic point at the mouth of the Gulf, where the trade routes of the Arabian Peninsula, Persia, and the Indian Ocean converged. It would produce one of the most extraordinary episodes in the entire history of the voyages, one that would play out not on the open ocean, but in the imperial court at Nanjing, in the form of a very large, very confused animal that had never been seen in China before, and that the court decided must be a sign from heaven that the Yongle Emperor's rule was divinely sanctioned. The giraffe, it turned out, had its own role to play in the politics of the Ming dynasty. The fourth voyage departed in 1413, and it was larger and more deliberately organized than anything that had come before. By this point, the fleet had enough experience with the Indian Ocean routes that it could operate with a degree of efficiency that the first voyage could never have managed. The ports were known, diplomatic relationships were established, at least in outline. The monsoon calendar was understood well enough that the timing of the departure could be planned with some confidence. What the fourth voyage needed to do was extend the network further, push past the limits of what the previous three voyages had reached, demonstrate that the Ming tributary system could operate at the western edge of the Indian Ocean as effectively as it had along the coasts of Southeast Asia and the Indian subcontinent. One of the things that made the fourth voyage different in its logistics was the practice of splitting the fleet into squadrons. The main fleet could not always move as a single unit to every destination simultaneously. Some ports were off the main route. Diplomatic missions required a detachment to branch away from the primary course and make a separate call before rejoining the main body. Zheng He had done some of this on earlier voyages. By the fourth voyage, it was becoming a more deliberate feature of how the operation worked. Smaller squadrons, each still formidable by the standards of any navy in the world at the time, peel away from the main fleet at certain points, conduct their own visits, and rendezvous with the rest of the fleet at a prearranged port. This allowed the network to expand without requiring the entire fleet to make every stop. It was an efficient solution to a genuine logistical problem. It meant that the fourth voyage covered more ground in more directions simultaneously than any of its predecessors. The main fleet moved through the familiar sequence of ports, down the South China Sea, through the Strait of Malacca, across the Bay of Bengal, along the Malabar coast of India. Calicut remained an important stop. The relationship with Calicut's ruler, the Zamorin, had been carefully cultivated across the previous voyages, and the port was one of the most important nodes in the entire Indian Ocean trading network. The spice trade moved through Calicut. Arab and Persian merchants were a constant presence there. The port was cosmopolitan in a way that made it useful for gathering information about what lay further west, about the ports of Arabia, about the trade routes that connected the Indian Ocean to the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea. And it was further west that the fourth voyage was now heading. Past Calicut, past the tip of the Indian subcontinent, the fleet moved toward the Arabian Sea and the approaches to the Persian Gulf. The destination was Hormuz, a port that sat at the mouth of the Gulf like a key in a lock, controlling access to the trade routes that ran up into Persia and beyond. Hormuz, in the early 15th century, was one of the most important commercial hubs in the entire connected world. Merchants from Arabia, Persia, East Africa, India, and Central Asia all passed through it. The goods that moved through Hormuz included Persian silk, Arabian horses, Indian cotton and spices, East African ivory and gold, 100 other commodities that tied the economies of 3 continents together. If you wanted to understand the Western Indian Ocean's commercial geography, Hormuz was where you needed to go. The fleet's arrival at Hormuz in 1414 was, by the standards of the time, an extraordinary event. No Chinese fleet had ever reached this far west. The ships that appeared at the mouth of the Persian Gulf were larger than anything the merchants and officials of Hormuz would have encountered before, and they arrived in numbers that made their purpose unmistakable. This was not a trading expedition in the ordinary sense. This was a state mission of the First Order, carrying the authority of the Ming Emperor and the expectation that the rulers of Hormuz would acknowledge that authority through the tribute system. The ruler of Hormuz, who was a vassal of the Timurid Empire at this point in history, was apparently willing to engage. Gifts were exchanged. Diplomatic courtesies were observed. Among the things that came back with the fleet, when it eventually turned east and headed home, were animals. Quite a lot of animals, as it turned out. The tribute system had always involved the exchange of goods and gifts, and exotic animals had been part of that exchange from the beginning. The logic was straightforward enough. Martian wars rulers who wanted to demonstrate their submission to the Ming Emperor, or at least their willingness to participate in the ceremonial framework of the tributary relationship, would send gifts that reflected the particular character of their lands. From Southeast Asia came aromatic woods and rare birds. From India came fine textiles and spices. From the Persian Gulf region came horses, which China always needed, never had enough of, and other animals that had no equivalent in the Chinese world. On the fourth voyage, the fleet came back with lions, leopards, and ostriches, among other things. These were impressive enough. But the animal that would make the fourth voyage genuinely famous, the one that would become a small episode in Chinese political history, was a giraffe. 2 giraffes were actually brought back. One sent by the ruler of Bengal, which had received the giraffe as a gift from the ruler of Malindi on the East African coast, and one sent directly as tribute. A giraffe from Bengal arrived in Nanjing in 1414, and the response it generated at the imperial court was remarkable. Scholars and officials who saw it immediately recognized its resemblance to a creature from Chinese mythology, the qilin. The qilin was a chimeric animal, part dragon, part deer, part ox with scales, hooves, the ability to walk without bending a blade of grass. It was associated with the rule of a virtuous emperor. It was said to appear only in times of perfect governance as a sign from heaven that the ruler was genuinely righteous and that the cosmic order was properly aligned with human affairs. The qilin was, in short, exactly the kind of omen that an emperor who had seized the throne by force from his nephew would very much like to have appeared during his reign. The Yongle emperor had never been entirely free of the question of his legitimacy. He had taken the throne in 1402 by force after a civil war, deposing and quite possibly killing the Jianwen emperor. His own nephew had been the legitimate heir. The official historical record was subsequently altered to minimize the Jianwen reign. But the political reality was that the Yongle emperor had come to power through usurpation. There were people in the court who remembered this. The Confucian framework that governed political thought in Ming China placed enormous weight on the idea of legitimate succession, the proper transmission of imperial authority from father to son, on the mandate of heaven as something that could be lost through moral failure. An emperor who had seized power by force had a particular need for sarsada signs that heaven approved of him. And here, arriving from a distant land via the ships of his most trusted animal was an animal that looked remarkably like the mythological creature that heaven sent to bless righteous rulers. The political theatre that followed was carefully managed. The Yongle emperor received the giraffe in a formal ceremony. Court artists painted it. Court poets wrote about it. Officials submitted memorials praising the appearance of the qilin as a sign of the emperor's virtue and the success of his governance. The emperor himself, a move that was either genuine modesty or very sophisticated public relations, initially demurred, suggesting that he was not certain he deserved such a sign. His officials reassured him. Giraffes stood in the imperial menagerie, long-necked and slightly baffled, while the Ming court used its existence as a prop in an ongoing argument about the legitimacy of the dynasty. It is hard not to find something gently absurd about this. A large African animal imported by a fleet of 9-masted ships, reinterpreted through a framework of Chinese mythology, deployed in an argument about whether a particular emperor had the right to sit on a particular throne. But it also tells you something genuine about how the tribute system worked and what it meant. The voyages were not just about trade or geography or military demonstration. They were about producing the kind of evidence that imperial legitimacy required. The giraffe was, in a very practical political sense, exactly what the Yongle emperor needed. The other animals that came back on the fourth and subsequent voyages were also received with considerable interest, even if they did not carry the same mythological weight as the giraffe. Lions were known from Chinese texts, but had never been seen in China itself. Leopards were similarly exotic. Ostriches were genuinely puzzling to people who had never encountered them. Large birds that could not fly, which seemed to violate the basic expectations one might have of birds. The imperial menagerie in Nanjing was becoming a remarkable collection, physical demonstration of the reach of the tributary network and the willingness of distant rulers to send their most extraordinary local products to the Ming court as expressions of submission and respect. But the fourth voyage was not only about animals and court ceremony, it was also about the expansion of Chinese geographic knowledge. Fleet's navigators and the men like Ma Huan, who travelled with the fleet and recorded what they observed, were gathering information about the Western Indian Ocean that had never been systematically compiled in Chinese before. Ma Huan's account, the Yingya Shenglan, or overall survey of the ocean's shores, described the ports, peoples, customs, products, and rulers that the fleet encountered. It recorded the distances between ports, the character of local rulers, the goods available for exchange, the religious practices of the populations the fleet visited. It was not a purely scientific document in the modern sense. It was a serious attempt to describe the world as the fleet had actually encountered it based on direct observation. The geographic knowledge it represented was, at the time of the fourth voyage, more extensive than anything available in Europe about the Indian Ocean world. The Portuguese would not reach Calicut until 1498, 87 years after Zheng He's fleet had already been there multiple times. The fleet's reach to Hormuz also expanded the diplomatic network in a concrete way. Hormuz sent envoys back with the fleet to Nanjing. Other ports along the route did the same. The fourth voyage returned to China in 1415, with representatives from no fewer than 19 states, each carrying tribute and each expecting to receive gifts and recognition in return. The scale of the diplomatic operation that the voyages had generated was becoming significant. The Ming court was receiving delegations from rulers across Southeast Asia, the Indian subcontinent, and now the Persian Gulf, all of them participating, at least nominally, in the tributary framework that the voyagers had established and maintained, and whether all of these rulers understood themselves Chinese superiorities to be acknowledging Chinese superiority in the way that the Ming court interpreted the exchange is a question that historians have debated at some length. The answer is probably that different rulers understood the relationship differently, and that the Ming court's interpretation and the local rulers' interpretation did not always coincide. What mattered for the practical functioning of the system was that the ceremonies were performed, the gifts were exchanged, and the trade continued. The deeper questions of sovereignty and hierarchy could be left somewhat ambiguous, as long as everyone got something useful out of the arrangement. Geographic expansion that the fourth voyage represented, Sun's voyage was not only a matter of reaching Hormuz. Some of the squadrons that had split off from the main fleet during the voyage had pushed further south toward the Arabian Peninsula and the coasts of East Africa. The fifth voyage, which would depart in 1416, would make that southward reach explicit and sustained. The fourth voyage had already begun to generate knowledge of and contact with the East African coast through the connections that ran through Hormuz and through the Arab and Persian merchants who were the intermediaries of that trade. The world that the fleet was navigating was not an empty ocean with isolated ports scattered along its edges. It was a connected network of trade routes, commercial relationships, and political arrangements that had been functioning for centuries before the Ming fleet arrived. What the fleet was doing was inserting itself into that network, claiming a place within it on behalf of the Ming emperor, and demonstrating that the reach of the tributary system extended as far as any ship could sail. By the time the fourth voyage returned in 1415, the pattern of the voyages had taken on a kind of momentum. The fleet was not simply a tool of imperial policy anymore, though it remained that. It had become, in a sense, an institution in its own right, with its own personnel, its own accumulated knowledge, its own established relationships with ports and rulers across the Indian Ocean world. Zheng He himself was now a figure of considerable standing, not just within the Ming court, but in the ports and kingdoms that the fleet had visited. His name, or at least the authority he represented, was known from the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf. The fleet he commanded was the largest and most powerful naval force in the world, and everyone who had encountered it knew this. The fifth voyage, when it came, would push the network further south and west than it had ever gone before, reaching the East African coast. in a sustained way for the first time, extending the geographic range of the voyages to somewhere in the vicinity of 12,000 nautical miles from Nanjing to the farthest points of the Swahili coast. That journey, what the fleet found when it got there, would add another dimension entirely to the story of what these voyages were and what they were trying to accomplish. The fifth voyage departed in 1416, and it was, in certain practical terms, a continuation of what the fourth had begun. The routes were familiar now, at least as far as the Indian coast. The fleet knew Calicut, it knew Hormuz, it knew the rhythm of the monsoon winds that governed movement across the Indian Ocean. The northeast monsoon that pushed ships southwestward in the winter months, the southwest monsoon that carried them back toward China in the summer. The sailors and navigators aboard the treasure ships had made this crossing before, but the fifth voyage was also something new, because this time the fleet would push further south and west than it had gone in any sustained, deliberate way. This time the East African coast was not a rumour or a distant extension of the Arab trade network. It was a destination. The Swahili coast, as it is known today, runs roughly along what is now Somalia, Kenya, and Tanzania. In the early 15th century, it was home to a string of city-states, each built around a harbour, each participating in a trade network that extended across the Indian Ocean to Arabia, Persia, and India. These were not small isolated settlements. Mogadishu, in what is now Somalia, is a substantial city with stone buildings and a long history of commerce. Mombasa, further south, was a well-established port. Malindi was known to Arab traders as a reliable stopping point. Kilwa, the Tanzanian coast, had been one of the wealthiest ports in the Indian Ocean world for centuries, trading in gold that came from the interior of Africa through networks that ran far inland. These cities were sophisticated, cosmopolitan places. They had their own currencies, their own architecture, their own systems of governance. They were not waiting to be discovered. They were already deeply embedded in the world that Zheng He's fleet was navigating. What the fleet found when it reached the Swahili coast was not a blank edge of the known world, but a functioning commercial civilization with its own set of relationships and priorities. The Swahili rulers were experienced in dealing with merchants from Arabia and Persia and India. They understood tribute exchange, diplomatic ceremony, and the practical value of maintaining good relations with powerful outsiders. When the Ming fleet arrived, enormous and unmistakably powerful, the response in most ports was cautious cooperation. Gifts were exchanged, envoys were offered. The local rulers sent representatives back to China with the fleet, along with local products that would serve as tribute. The ceremonies that had become familiar in the ports of Southeast Asia and India were performed again here on the eastern edge of Africa, with rulers who had never previously had any contact with China. The animals were again part of the story. The fifth voyage brought back more giraffes. This was not accidental. The giraffe that had arrived in Nanjing during the fourth voyage had caused such excitement at court, been received with such ceremony, and interpreted with such political significance, as a qilin, as a divine omen of legitimate rule, that the Yongle emperor was clearly interested in receiving more. The Swahili coast, and specifically the areas around Malindi and Mogadishu, was one of the places where giraffes could be obtained either directly or through trade with the interior. Zebras came back as well, ostriches. In the records that survive from this period, the animals are mentioned alongside the diplomatic exchanges and the tribute goods, as part of the same category of remarkable things that the fleet brought home to demonstrate the reach of the emperor's influence. Each animal was, in a sense, a message. It said, "The world is large, and all of it acknowledges you." The sixth voyage followed in 1421, and it extended the same pattern further. The fleet visited many of the same ports, reinforced the same diplomatic relationships, and pushed the geographic range of the voyages to something that, when you sit down and actually calculate it, is genuinely difficult to absorb. From Nanjing to the East African coast is roughly 12,000 nautical miles. The fleet was not simply sailing that distance, in a straight line of course. It was stopping at dozens of ports, navigating through the South China Sea, crossing the Bay of Bengal, rounding the tip of India, traversing the Arabian Sea, and then continuing south along the African coast. Total distance sailed during a single voyage, accounting for all the routes and detours and return journeys, was considerably more than the straight-line figure. These were not short trips. The fifth voyage lasted approximately 3 years. The sixth was similar in duration. The men aboard the ship spent enormous stretches of time at sea, away from China, living within the floating world of the fleet, which raises a question that is easy to overlook when you are focused on the grand diplomatic and geographic picture. How did you actually keep 27,000 men alive and functioning for years at a time on the open ocean? The answer involves a level of organizational complexity that is, in its own way, as impressive as the ships themselves. The fleet was not a single mass of vessels all doing the same thing. It was a structured system. There were specialized ships for carrying horses, which were needed both for transport and for the cavalry that accompanied landing parties. There were supply ships carrying grain, dried food, and other provisions. There were water ships, essentially floating tanks, carrying fresh water for the crew. There were troop transports. There were warships. There were smaller patrol and communication vessels that could move quickly between the larger ships and carry messages and orders across the fleet. The treasure ships themselves, the Great Baochuan, were the flagships and the diplomatic centers of the operation, but they were supported by this entire system of specialized vessels that made the enterprise function. Navigation across these distances required real skill and accumulated knowledge. The fleet used magnetic compasses, which Chinese mariners had been using for centuries, which were more developed and reliable than what European sailors were working with at the same period. They used star charts, observing the altitude of stars above the horizon, to determine their latitude, a technique known in Chinese navigation as taking star readings. They used depth soundings, lowering weighted lines to measure the depth of water, which helped them identify their position relative to known underwater features and avoid running aground in unfamiliar coastal waters. The pilots and navigators of the fleet had accumulated across the first several voyages an extensive body of practical knowledge about the Indian Ocean, where the currents ran, where the winds shifted, which months were safe for which crossings, where fresh water could be found, which anchorages were reliable. Some of this knowledge was written down. Navigation charts that the fleet used were detailed practical documents, recording routes, distances, landmarks, and hazards. These charts would later be among the documents that were destroyed after the voyages ended. Their loss is one of the genuine intellectual tragedies of the period. Food was managed through a combination of supplies carried from China, provisions taken on at ports along the route, and fishing. The fleet's sheer size meant that it could carry substantial stores of rice, dried fish, salted vegetables, and other preserved foods. The watertight bulkhead construction of the Chinese ships, which divided the hull into separate compartments, also meant that the ships could carry live animals and fresh produce for longer than a conventional open hold would allow. Ports along the route were expected to provide supplies in exchange for the goods and gifts the fleet brought, and this was part of the practical logic of the tribute system. It was not only about diplomatic ceremony, it was also about the logistics of keeping a large fleet moving across long distances. A port that cooperated with the fleet got Chinese goods, Chinese recognition, Chinese protection. A port that did not cooperate found itself in a considerably more difficult position. The Swahili city-states were for the most part cooperative. The existing archaeological record along the East African coast offers some quiet confirmation of the contact that the Chinese records describe. Chinese porcelain has been found at Kilwa, at Mombasa, at Malindi, and at other sites along the coast. Some of it dates to the Song and Yuan dynasties before Zheng He's voyages, which tells us that Chinese goods were reaching East Africa through the existing Arab and Persian trade networks long before the Ming fleet arrived in person. But some of the porcelain found at these sites dates to the Yongle period, the early 15th century, which corresponds precisely to the years of the voyages. These are not large, dramatic finds. They are sherds, fragments, pieces of bowls and dishes recovered from the soil of old port cities. But they are real. They confirm that Chinese goods were present at these sites during the period when the fleet was visiting. They are small physical traces of an enormous historical event. The fleet's presence on the Swahili coast was not purely ceremonial. It was also, in a practical sense, a demonstration of power. Treasure ships were the largest vessels that anyone on the East African coast had ever seen. The fleet's military capability, its warships, and its armed soldiers, and its capacity for organized violence, was evident to anyone who looked at it. The rulers of the Swahili city-states were experienced traders and diplomats. They would have understood immediately that the Ming fleet was not simply a trading expedition in the ordinary sense. It was a political statement backed by force. Cooperation was the sensible response. Cooperation is largely what the fleet received. There is something worth pausing on here about what the voyages were and were not. The fleet did not establish permanent settlements on the East African coast. It did not claim territory. It did not attempt to control the trade routes it was using in the way that the Portuguese would later attempt to do when they arrived in the same waters at the end of the 15th century. The Ming model was different. The fleet came, demonstrated power, exchanged gifts, received tribute, loaded up envoys and exotic animals, and left. It came back a few years later and did the same thing again. The relationship it was building was one of acknowledged hierarchy and mutual benefit, not one of territorial control or commercial monopoly. Whether this was a principled choice or simply a reflection of the logistical limits of what the fleet could sustain is a question that historians have debated. Probably it was both. The tributary model genuinely reflected the way the Ming court understood its relationship with the outside world. But it was also true that permanently occupying a port 12,000 nautical miles from Nanjing was not something the fleet had the capacity or the mandate to do. The sixth voyage ended in 1422, and the fleet returned to China carrying another collection of foreign envoys, another load of tribute goods, and another set of remarkable animals for the imperial menagerie. The Yongle emperor received them. The ceremonies were performed, the records were updated, and then, not long after, things began to change. The Yongle emperor was aging. He had been conducting military campaigns in Mongolia, pursuing the Mongol threat on China's northern frontier, and these campaigns were costly and exhausting. The empire's resources were under pressure from multiple directions simultaneously. The voyages were enormously expensive. A fleet of 300 ships carrying 27,000 men required staggering quantities of food, timber, silk, porcelain, copper cash, and silver to function. The Confucian scholar officials who administered the Ming bureaucracy had never been enthusiastic about the voyages. Their objections were both practical and ideological. Practically, the voyages consumed resources that could be spent on the northern frontier, on flood control, on agriculture, the things that a properly ordered state was supposed to prioritize. Ideologically, the Confucian worldview held that China was self-sufficient, that it had no need of foreign things. The proper business of government was the cultivation of virtue and order within the realm, not the pursuit of exotic animals and distant tribute from barbarian rulers. The voyages, in this view, were a distraction at best and a corruption of proper governance at worst. The Yongle Emperor had been powerful enough to override these objections for 2 decades. His personal authority, his political ambition, his genuine interest in the voyages had kept the enterprise going against the grain of what much of the bureaucracy believed. But the emperor was not immortal, and in 1424 he died on campaign in Mongolia. With him went the political engine that had driven the entire enterprise. The voyages had always depended on imperial will. That will was now gone. What came next would test whether the voyages could survive without it. The Yongle Emperor died on the 12th day of the 8th month of 1424, somewhere on the Mongolian steppe, far from Nanjing and far from the sea. He'd been on campaign pursuing the remnants of the Mongol forces that continued to threaten China's northern frontier, and the campaign had worn him down. He was in his early 60s. He had ruled for 22 years, and moved the capital from Nanjing to Beijing, had built the Forbidden City, had commissioned the great encyclopedia known as the Yongle Dadian, had sent the largest fleet in human history across the Indian Ocean 7 times. He died in a military tent, not a palace. His body was carried back to Beijing in a sealed litter, and for a time news of his death was kept quiet, so that the army would not lose order on the long march home. The man who succeeded him was his son, who took the reign title Hongxi, and almost immediately the new emperor made his position on the voyages absolutely clear. Within months of taking the throne, the Hongxi emperor issued an edict suspending all future treasure voyages. The ships were to remain in port, sailors and soldiers were to be reassigned or dismissed. The shipyards were to stop construction. Zheng He himself, the admiral who had commanded 6 of the 7 great expeditions, and who had spent the better part of 2 decades at sea, was recalled to Nanjing and given a new role, commander of the Nanjing garrison. It was a position of some dignity, but it was also unmistakably a way of keeping him occupied and on land. The ocean was no longer his assignment. The Hongxi emperor's decision was not impulsive. It reflected the views of the Confucian scholar officials who'd been waiting a long time for exactly this moment. These were the men who ran the day-to-day machinery of the Ming state, staffed the ministries and the censorate and the boards of administration, who drafted the edicts and kept the records and advised the throne on matters of policy. They were educated. They were capable. For 22 years, they had watched the Yongle Emperor spend enormous sums of money, sending ships to places they considered irrelevant, bringing back animals they considered frivolous, conducting diplomacy they considered unnecessary. The Yongle Emperor had been too powerful to argue with directly. His son was more receptive to their counsel. The cost argument was the one most easily made in concrete terms. A single treasure voyage required provisioning something in the range of 200 to 300 vessels for journeys of 2 to 3 years. The silk and porcelain and copper cash, carried as gifts and trade goods, represented real imperial expenditure. The grain required to feed 27,000 men at sea had to come from somewhere, in a country that was simultaneously funding military campaigns in the north and managing the enormous administrative costs of a recently relocated capital. The question of where to direct resources was genuinely pressing. The voyages were not, in the Confucian accounting of things, producing a return that justified their expense. The tribute goods that came back, the exotic animals, the foreign envoys, the spices and ivory and medicinal plants, these were ceremonially valuable, but not economically transformative in the way the officials understood economic value. The tributary system was not designed to generate profit in the commercial sense. It was designed to demonstrate prestige, and prestige, the Confucian officials argued, could be demonstrated at considerably lower cost. The ideological argument ran deeper than the financial one. The Confucian worldview that shaped the Ming bureaucracy held that China, the Middle Kingdom, was the center of civilization, that the proper order of the world consisted of surrounding peoples acknowledging that centrality and behaving accordingly, that the emperor's primary responsibility was to maintain virtue, order, and stability within the realm. The idea that China needed to go out into the world to seek things, to travel to distant coasts, to collect animals, and solicit tribute from foreign rulers, implied a kind of need or incompleteness that sat uncomfortably with this worldview. Properly ordered empire did not chase stuff through the world. The world came to it. The Voyages in this reading had things exactly backwards. They were a display of imperial energy directed outward when it should have been directed inward. There was also, underneath the ideological language, a more practical concern about power. The Voyages had been the Yongle Emperor's project, driven by his personal ambition and executed through his personal favorites, of whom Zheng He was the most prominent. The eunuch admirals who commanded the fleet represented a kind of power within the imperial system that the Confucian officials found troubling. Eunuchs were imperial servants, technically subordinate to the scholarly bureaucracy in the formal hierarchy of the state. But in practice, the Yongle Emperor had used them as a counterweight to the officials, giving them commands and resources that bypassed the normal administrative channels. The Voyages were the most visible expression of this pattern. Ending the Voyages was, among other things, a way of reasserting the proper order of things, of returning authority to the scholars and away from the eunuchs. It was bureaucratic politics as much as it was fiscal policy. Zheng He spent this period in Nanjing, commanding the garrison, waiting. He was somewhere in his mid-50s, a man who had spent his adult life in motion, crossing the Indian Ocean and back again, managing the logistics of fleets that dwarfed anything else on the water. Now he was on land in an administrative role in a city that was no longer even the primary capital. He thought about this transition is not recorded. The sources that survive from his life are mostly official documents, inscriptions, and records of the Voyages themselves. His inner life is largely invisible to us, but it is not hard to imagine that a man who had sailed to East Africa and back, who had navigated the Persian Gulf and the Malabar coast and the Strait of Malacca, had commanded the largest naval expeditions in history, found the Nanjing garrison a somewhat quieter posting. The Hongxi Emperor's reign lasted 9 months. He died in May of 1425, apparently of a heart condition, having barely had time to establish himself on the throne. His son, who took the reign title Xuande, succeeded him. The Xuande Emperor was a different kind of ruler from his father. He was more curious, more culturally engaged, more interested in the world beyond China's borders. He was also, in his own way, a capable administrator who understood that the Ming state's prestige depended in part on its relationships with the broader world. The Confucian officials were still powerful, still influential, still present in all their administrative weight. But the new emperor was willing to listen to other voices as well. It took a few years, but eventually the Xuande emperor decided that one more voyage should be made. The diplomatic network that the Yongle emperor's voyages had built was beginning to fray. Foreign rulers who had sent tribute missions to Nanjing were no longer hearing from the Ming court. The relationships that had been cultivated over 6 expeditions needed maintenance. There were also practical questions about the status of Chinese communities in Southeast Asia and about the security of the trade routes that Chinese merchants depended on. The case for a 7th voyage was made, and the emperor accepted it. Zheng He was recalled from his garrison posting and given command once more. The order to prepare the fleet must have required considerable work. Ships that had been mothballed for years needed inspection and repair. Crews had to be assembled, provisions gathered, trade goods loaded. The organizational machinery of the Treasure Voyages had not entirely disappeared during the suspension. But it had been idle, and idle things require effort to restart. The inscription that Zheng He and his officers carved into stone at the Tianfei Temple in Fujian in 1431 before the seventh voyage departed gives some sense of the preparations. It records the voyages that had already been made, the countries visited, the distances covered, the tribute received. It reads partly as a record and partly as something closer to a testament, a permanent marking of what had been accomplished before the fleet set out one final time. The inscription survives. It is one of the most important primary sources we have for the voyages, written in Zheng He's own era by people who were there. What the inscription does not record, because it was written before the voyage began, is how the seventh expedition would end. Zheng He was in his early 60s by this point. He had been making these voyages, with interruptions, for nearly 30 years. The physical demands of commanding a fleet at sea were considerable even for a younger man. Heat of the tropics, the months at sea, the navigational stress, the diplomatic negotiations, the constant management of 27,000 people in a floating city spread across hundreds of ships. It was not a light burden, yet there he was, preparing to go again. The fleet departed from Liujiang in January of 1431. It was the largest and most experienced fleet China had ever sent to sea, crewed by men who had made these journeys before, navigating routes that were by now well charted in the fleet's accumulated knowledge. The star charts, the compass bearings, the depth soundings, the records of ports and currents and seasonal winds. All of this had been built up over 6 previous voyages and represented a body of navigational knowledge that was, at that moment, unmatched anywhere in the world. Where the 7th voyage would go, and what it would find, and what would happen to Zheng He himself before it was over, belongs to the next part of this story. Before moving there, it is worth sitting for a moment with the political drama that had just played out, because it tells us something important about the nature of the voyages and their fragility. The entire enterprise has rested on a single man's will. The Yongle Emperor had wanted the voyages, had funded them, had protected them from the officials who opposed them, given Zheng He the authority and resources to execute them on a scale that was genuinely extraordinary. When that man died, the voyages stopped within months. When a more sympathetic emperor came to power, restarted, but only barely, only once, only because the diplomatic consequences of complete abandonment were too visible to ignore. This is different from the way European maritime expansion would work. Portugal and Spain began sending ships down the African coast and across the Atlantic in the latter half of the 15th century. Those voyages were driven not only by royal will, but by merchant capital, by commercial interest, by the private ambition of sailors and investors who stood to profit directly from what they found. The enterprise had an economic engine that could outlast any individual monarch. Zheng He's voyages had no such engine. They were an imperial project funded by the state, justified by the logic of tributary prestige, and entirely dependent on the emperor's personal commitment. The moment that commitment wavered, the whole enterprise became vulnerable in a way that no amount of navigational skill or organizational excellence could protect against. Confucian officials had been right about one thing, even if their reasoning was partly self-interested. The voyages could not sustain themselves on their own logic. They required continuous imperial investment and imperial will. In 1424 that will ran out. In 1430 it flickered back to life one more time. What would happen after the 7th voyage returned was already, in a sense, determined by the political forces that had been building since long before the fleet left port. The ships moved south through the South China Sea, following the familiar route toward Malacca, toward the Malabar coast, toward the Persian Gulf and the Red Sea and the East African ports that the fleet had visited before. Zheng He, standing somewhere on the deck of one of those great vessels, watching the coast of China recede behind him, would have known these waters as well as any navigator alive. He'd spent a significant portion of his life on them. The stars above were the same stars he'd used to navigate for 3 decades. The wind in the sails was the same monsoon wind that had carried the fleet south and east and west and home again, voyage after voyage, year after year. The ocean, as it always does, kept its own counsel about what lay ahead. This 7th voyage followed the routes the fleet knew well: Champa, Java, Malacca, the Malabar coast of India, and Hormuz at the mouth of the Persian Gulf. These were not new destinations. They were by this point almost familiar stops on a circuit that the fleet had travelled enough times to have developed its own rhythms around. It's the monsoon winds that blow southwest in Indian Ocean from roughly April through September, and then reverse direction through the winter months, had shaped every voyage. The navigators understood them the way a farmer understands the seasons. You did not fight the monsoon, you planned around it, used it, waited for it to shift. The fleet moved with a patience that modern travel makes almost impossible to imagine. At Hormuz, the fleet conducted the same kind of tributary exchanges it had made on previous visits. Hormuz sat at the pinch point between the Persian Gulf and the Arabian Sea, and it was one of the great trading hubs of the medieval world. Merchants from Persia, Arabia, India, East Africa, Central Asia all passed through or stopped there. Chinese porcelain and silk had been arriving in this part of the world for centuries, through overland routes, but the arrival of the treasure fleet by sea was a different kind of statement. It was not just trade, it was presence. The scale of the fleet communicated something that no merchant caravan could. The ships, the soldiers, the formal ceremonies of exchange, the gifts presented and received, all of it was theatre with a political message underneath it. The message, as it had been from the beginning, was that the Ming Emperor was the centre of the world's order, and these distant kingdoms were invited to acknowledge that from Hormuz, portions of the fleet continued westward toward Aden, the port city at the southern tip of the Arabian Peninsula that controlled access to the Red Sea, and beyond it to Egypt and the Mediterranean trade networks. Aden was not new territory for the fleet either. It had been visited on earlier voyages. But on the 7th voyage, there is evidence that the reach extended further than it had before, or at least that certain members of the expedition went further than the main fleet. Zheng He's deputy, a eunuch official named Hong Bao, is believed by some historians to have travelled from Aden overland, or by smaller vessel to Mecca itself. Zheng He was a Muslim, born into a family whose faith had been part of their identity for generations. Father and grandfather had made the Hajj. The possibility that one of the senior officers of the 7th voyage, perhaps Hong Bao acting on Zheng He's behalf, reached the holiest city in Islam is not confirmed by surviving Chinese records in the way that other stops on the voyage are documented, but it is considered plausible by scholars who have studied the period. Some accounts suggest that Zheng He himself may have arranged for prayers or offerings to be made at Mecca by proxy, if not in person. The fleet was already in the neighbourhood. By the standards of the Indian Ocean world, Aden is roughly 2 weeks' sail from Mecca's nearest port of Jeddah. For a fleet that had already crossed 12,000 nautical miles from Nanjing to East Africa, that was not an impossible distance. Whether or not Mecca was actually reached, the 7th voyage continued down the East African coast to the ports the fleet had visited on the 5th and 6th voyages: Mogadishu, Brava, Malindi, the Swahili city-states that had been sending envoys and exotic animals back to China since the early years of the voyages. The relationships that had been established over the previous 2 decades were maintained. More tribute was exchanged. More animals were probably loaded onto the horse ships for transport back to China. though the records of the seventh voyage are thinner than those of some earlier expeditions. East African ports were, by any measure, the farthest point the fleet regularly reached. Malindi sits on the Kenyan coast, at roughly 3 degrees south of the equator. Nanjing is at 32 degrees north. The distance between them, following the route the fleet would have taken through the South China Sea and across the Indian Ocean, is somewhere in the range of 12,000 nautical miles. To put that in some kind of perspective, distance from Lisbon to the Caribbean, the route Columbus would sail in 1492, is about 4,000 nautical miles. The treasure fleet's regular operating range was 3 times that. It was doing this with a fleet of hundreds of ships carrying tens of thousands of men, with sufficient supplies and organizational discipline to sustain the voyage for months at a time. The navigation that made all of this possible was not primitive. The fleet used magnetic compasses, which Chinese sailors have been using at sea since at least the 11th century, well before European sailors adopted them. They used star charts, particularly tracking the altitude of stars above the horizon, to determine their latitude, a method that requires careful observation and accumulated knowledge to use reliably. They used depth soundings to understand the sea floor in shallow coastal waters. They kept detailed records of currents, seasonal wind patterns, and the appearance of coastlines. The navigational manuals that the fleet accumulated over 7 voyages represented an extraordinary body of practical knowledge, though most of it would eventually be lost, along with the other records that were suppressed or destroyed in the decades after the voyages ended. It was on the return from this 7th voyage that Zheng He died. The exact circumstances are not entirely clear, which is perhaps fitting for a man whose life was full of gaps in the written record. What the sources suggest is that he died sometime in 1433, during or shortly after the return journey. He was in his early to mid-60s, which was not young for a man who had spent so much of his life at sea in the heat of the tropics. Some accounts say he was buried at sea, befitting a great admiral. Others suggest his body was brought back to China, and that he has a tomb near Nanjing on the slopes of Niushou Mountain, though some historians note that this tomb may be a cenotaph rather than an actual burial site, since the body may indeed have been committed to the ocean. The tomb near Nanjing exists. It is modest by the standards of the man it commemorates. A stone path leads up through trees to a small enclosure. There is an inscription. There are offerings left by visitors. It is not a grand imperial monument of the kind that the Yongle Emperor built for himself. It is quiet, and in its quietness it carries a kind of melancholy that feels appropriate. Zheng He was the most powerful admiral in the history of the world at that moment, commanding fleets that no other civilization could have assembled, sailing routes that no other navigator had fully charted, representing an empire of extraordinary wealth and sophistication. And his memorial is a modest hillside grave that most people in the world have never heard of. The fleet returned to China without him. The ships came back into the ports along the Fujian coast, and eventually to Nanjing, carrying the tribute goods, the diplomatic letters, the surviving crew, and the accumulated records of the 7th and final voyage. The Xuande Emperor received the returning fleet. The tributary ceremonies were conducted, and then quietly, the great enterprise of the Treasure Voyages was over. There would not be an 8th voyage. The Xuande Emperor authorized the 7th voyage partly for diplomatic reasons, partly perhaps out of genuine interest, did not order another. The Confucian officials who had opposed the voyages for decades had not gone away. The cost argument had not become any weaker. The northern frontier, where Mongol pressure remained a persistent concern, still demanded military resources and attention. Tributary relationships that the voyages had established could be maintained through smaller, less expensive diplomatic missions. Logic for continuing the enormous fleets across the Indian Ocean, at enormous cost, became harder to sustain. Once the emperor who had revived the program was gone, there is something worth pausing on here, which is the sheer completeness of what the seventh voyage accomplished before it ended. The fleet had visited Hormuz, Aden, possibly Mecca, the East African coast, the full chain of ports along the Indian Ocean that the voyagers had been working since 1405. In 28 years across 7 voyages, Zheng He and the fleets he commanded had established diplomatic contact with more than 30 countries, had mapped the Indian Ocean world more comprehensively than any previous Chinese navigator, had brought back animals, plants, medicines, textiles, and knowledge that enriched the Ming court's understanding of the world beyond China's borders. They had done all of this without establishing a single permanent colony, without claiming any territory for China, without setting up trading posts in the European colonial sense, without leaving behind the kind of institutional infrastructure that would entrench Fentrikers, that would have allowed the enterprise to continue after imperial support was withdrawn. That last point is not a criticism. It reflects a genuine difference in the logic and purpose of the voyages, compared to what European maritime expansion would later look like. The treasure voyages were not designed to generate private profit. They were designed to project imperial prestige and to bring distant kingdoms into the tributary relationship with the Ming court. They succeeded at that goal repeatedly and impressively. The tributary model did not create the kind of self-sustaining commercial incentive that would have kept ships sailing regardless of what any particular emperor thought about it. Zheng He died at sea or near enough to it somewhere in the Indian Ocean or the South China Sea in 1433. The fleet came home. The Chang'e inscription, carved in stone before the voyage departed, remained standing at the Tianfei Temple in Fujian as a record of what had been done. It would survive the decades of suppression that followed, which is partly why we know as much as we do about the voyages. Stone is harder to burn than paper. The men who had sailed with Zheng He, the sailors and soldiers and interpreters and doctors and craftsmen, and officials who had made up the floating city of 27,000, dispersed back into the ordinary life of the empire. Some settled in the port cities along the Fujian coast. Some returned to inland provinces. Some had already died at sea on earlier voyages, or in the battle at Palembang, or in Ceylon, or from disease in the heat of foreign ports. The fleet itself, the great Baochuan treasure ships and their escort vessels, sat in the shipyards and hand harbours of the Chinese coast, waiting for orders that would never come. What happened next? The deliberate suppression of the voyages and the destruction of the records. It's a story that belongs to the years after 1433, when the political forces that had always opposed the enterprise finally gained the upper hand. The end of the 7th voyage is the natural place to pause and recognise what had just finished. The greatest fleet in the history of the world had completed its final journey. The admiral who had led it for nearly 3 decades was gone. The ocean that had carried him from Nanjing to Hormuz to East Africa and back again, season after season, voyage after voyage, continued moving as it always had, indifferent to the fact that the red silk sails and the 9-masted treasure ships would not be coming back. The silence that followed the return of the 7th voyage was not immediate. There were still tributary missions, still diplomatic correspondence, still the ordinary machinery of the Ming court's foreign relations. But the voyages, as a living enterprise, as something that would be renewed and expanded and continued, were finished. What remained was the question of what would be done with everything they had left behind. The records, the charts, the accumulated knowledge, the relationships, the physical evidence of 30 years of extraordinary effort. The answer to that question, and the way it was answered, would shape how the world remembered, or failed to remember, what Zheng He had done. That is where the story goes next. The silence did not last long before it was filled with something deliberate. The years immediately following the return of the seventh voyage, the political atmosphere in Nanjing shifted in ways that had been building for decades. The Xuande Emperor, who had authorized that final journey, died in 1435, just 2 years after the fleet came home. He was 36 years old, and his death brought to the throne a child emperor, the Zheng Emperor, who was only 7 at the time of his accession. Real power during those early years passed to a regency council, and the Confucian scholar officials who had deposed the Voyages for so long found themselves in a position they had not fully held before. The institutional resistance to maritime expansion, which had always been present and always been argued, now had the political weight to become policy. To understand what happened next, it helps to understand what the Confucian official class actually objected to, because it was not simply a matter of cost. The cost was certainly part of the argument. The deeper objection was ideological. Dominant Confucian worldview held that China was the center of civilization, that the proper order of the world involved foreign peoples coming to acknowledge that fact, that the emperor's role was to govern his own people well, not to go chasing relationships with distant barbarians at enormous expense. Trade in this framework was not something an emperor should be seen to depend on or pursue. The tribute system, as a concept, was acceptable because it placed China in a position of receiving acknowledgement from others. But the Voyages, with their vast cost in silver and grain and timber and human labour, looked less like the dignified receipt of tribute and more like an expensive effort to go and persuade people to participate in something they might not have chosen on their own. That distinction mattered to the officials who saw the Voyages as a kind of undignified scramble for prestige, dressed up in the language of imperial dignity. It was also the question of what the Voyages represented in terms of values. The Confucian order placed merchants and commercial activity near the bottom of the social hierarchy. Farmers were more respected than traders. Scholars and officials sat at the top. The Voyages, whatever their official diplomatic purpose, involved the movement of enormous quantities of goods, the enrichment of certain merchant classes and port cities, the kind of outward-looking engagement with the world that felt to many officials like a distraction from the proper business of governing China from within. The northern frontier, where Mongol pressure remained a genuine military concern, was in their view a far more urgent claim on imperial resources than the maintenance of relationships with kingdoms in Arabia and East Africa. So, the political balance shifted after 1435. The opposition did not need to invent new arguments. It had been making the same arguments for years. Now, it simply had the authority to act on them. The fleet, already mothballed after the 7th voyage, was left to deteriorate. The great Baochuan treasure ships, those 9-masted vessels, measuring more than 100 meters in length, sat in the shipyards and harbors of the Fujian coast and along the Yangtze near Nanjing. Without maintenance, without crews, without the institutional support that had kept them operational across 7 voyages, they began to rot. Timber exposed to salt air, and water does not last long without care. The ships that had sailed to East Africa and Hormuz, and the Persian Gulf that had carried 27,000 men across the Indian Ocean, became wood and rust and decay. There was no dramatic burning of the fleet, no single act of destruction. It was quieter than that, and in some ways worse. They were simply abandoned, left to fall apart in the places where they had been built. The records were a different matter. The navigational charts, the detailed logs, the accumulated geographic knowledge of 7 voyages across 30 years, these were not simply left to deteriorate. There is evidence that they were actively destroyed. The most specific account of this destruction comes from the 1470s, during the reign of the Chenghua Emperor, when a court official named Liu Daxia was working in the Ministry of War. A eunuch official at court, whose name is recorded as Wang Ji, asked Liu Daxia to locate the records of Zheng He's voyages. apparently hoping to use them as the basis for a new expedition. Liu Daxia reportedly responded by saying that the voyages had been a waste of resources and a bad precedent, and that the records had either been lost or should not be found. Some accounts suggest he personally removed them from the archives before they could be located. Other accounts, recorded by a later writer named Yan Kongjian, say more directly that Liu Daxia burned the navigation charts. The exact truth of this is difficult to establish because, in a certain irony, the destruction of the records means there are very few records left to consult. What survives is a secondary account, written decades after the fact, attributed to a man who had reasons of his own to frame the story in particular ways. But the general picture is consistent with what we can observe from the outside, which is that the detailed navigational records of the Treasure Voyages essentially vanished. Charts that Zheng He's navigators had used across the Indian Ocean to identify the ports of East Africa, to navigate the straits of Southeast Asia, were gone, not lost to fire or flood, the ordinary accidents of time, but gone in the way that things go when people in positions of power decide they should not exist. Haijin, the sea ban, formalized this retreat from the ocean. The policy, which had existed in various forms even before the voyages, was now enforced with new seriousness. Chinese subjects were prohibited from building ocean-going vessels above a certain size. Private maritime trade was restricted. The great ports that had been connected to the Indian Ocean world for centuries were gradually cut off from the trade networks that had sustained them. Quanzhou, which had been one of the largest ports in the world during the Song and Yuan dynasties, shrank. Merchant communities that had grown up around the maritime trade found themselves operating outside the law or not operating at all. What makes this particularly striking is the timing. In 1433, Zheng He's fleet made its last journey. In 1492, Christopher Columbus crossed the Atlantic with 3 ships, the largest of which, the Santa Maria, was roughly 19 meters long. Columbus's entire fleet could have fit on the deck of a single Vaochuan treasure ship with room to spare. In 1498, Vasco da Gama rounded the Cape of Good Hope and reached Calicut on India's Malabar coast, the same port that Zheng He had visited on the third voyage, the same port where Ming stelae had been erected and tribute relationships established. Da Gama arrived with 4 ships and a crew of about 170 men. He found a city that had already been visited by the largest fleet in the world less than a century before, and had no idea. The records were gone, the ships had rotted, the knowledge had been buried. Gama's arrival at Calicut in 1498 was not a friendly encounter. He demanded trading rights, threatened violence, and eventually fired cannons at the city. The Portuguese model of maritime expansion was not the tributary model of the Ming voyages. It was extraction enforced by military power built on the logic of commercial profit. Within a few decades, Portugal had established the Estado da India, network of fortified trading posts along the Indian Ocean coast that gave European merchants control over the spice trade routes that Zheng He's fleet had navigated peacefully for 30 years. The world that Zheng He had moved through, the world of the Swahili city-states and the Arab merchants of Hormuz and the spice traders of Calicut, is about to change in ways that no one in the Ming court had anticipated when they decided to burn the charts and let the ships rot. It is worth being careful here about what this means and what it does not mean. The suppression of the voyages did not cause European colonialism. Portugal would have found its way to the Indian Ocean eventually, with or without Chinese competition. Structural forces driving European expansion, the profit motive, the private merchant capital, the competitive state system, a particular combination of technology and ambition that characterized 15th century Iberian maritime culture. These were not things that Chinese maritime activity could have simply displaced. The world does not pivot on single decisions quite that cleanly, but the contrast is still worth sitting with. the greatest maritime enterprise in history, one that had demonstrated beyond any reasonable doubt that China possessed the ships, the navigational knowledge, the organizational capacity, and the diplomatic reach to project power across the Indian Ocean world, was deliberately dismantled. The decision was not made because the voyagers had failed. They had not failed. They had accomplished everything they were designed to accomplish. Decision was made because a particular group of officials, working within a particular ideological framework, concluded that the voyagers were incompatible with the kind of empire they believed China should be. Physical evidence of the destruction is not dramatic. There is no monument to the burning of the charts. There is no official record saying, "On this date, we decided to forget what we knew." The suppression happened gradually, through administrative decisions, through the quiet removal of documents, through the slow decay of unmaintained ships, through the enforcement of the sea ban, through the simple passage of time. Within a generation or two, the specific technical knowledge of how to build a Baochuan, how to navigate the Indian Ocean, how to organize a fleet of 300 ships and 27,000 men faded. The craftsmen who knew how to lay the keels of the great treasure ships grew old and died without passing their knowledge on to apprentices, because there were no ships to build and no reason to learn. Navigators who had used the star charts to cross from Calicut to Hormuz were gone. The institutional memory of the voyages existed only in fragments, the stone inscriptions that had survived because they were too heavy to move, in the accounts of foreign travellers who had witnessed the fleet's arrival in their own ports, the occasional reference in Ming court documents that had escaped the purge. The Changal inscription, carved in 1431 before the seventh voyage departed, is one of the most important surviving primary sources we have. It is a stone stele erected at the Tianfei Temple in Fujian, and it records in Zheng He's own words, at least in words attributed to him and his colleague, Wang Jinghong, the purpose and accomplishments of the voyages. Stone does not burn as easily as paper. The inscription survived because it was in a temple, because it was large, because removing it would have required effort and decision that no one apparently thought worth making. It survived almost by accident, or perhaps by the simple physical stubbornness of carved stone in a place where no one thought to look for things worth destroying. The stelae erected in Calicut and Galin Ceylon survived in their own ways, partly through the indifference of local populations to Ming imperial politics happening thousands of miles away, partly through the ordinary durability of stone. They are fragmentary and damaged, but they exist. They confirm that the fleet was there, that it erected monuments, that it engaged in the formal diplomatic ceremonies that the tributary system required. They are small physical anchors for a story that might otherwise seem too large to be entirely real. The Nanjing shipyard at Longjiang, where the treasure ships were built, has left behind physical traces as well. Archaeological work at the site in the 20th century uncovered a rudder post, an enormous piece of timber roughly 11-meter long that is consistent with the scale of the Baochuan, as described in the written sources. 11-meter is the length of a large tree. It is the length of a rudder post for a ship that was itself longer than a football field. Holding that measurement in your mind makes the written descriptions feel less like exaggeration and more like straightforward engineering fact. What has not been found, at least not yet, is a confirmed wreck of a Baochuan. South China Sea and the Indian Ocean have been surveyed by underwater archaeologists, and Chinese porcelain and other trade goods have been found at numerous sites along the routes the voyagers travelled. Kilwa in Tanzania, Mombasa, Malindi. These places have yielded Chinese ceramics consistent with the period of the voyagers, but no one has yet located the remains of a treasure ship on the seabed. Given the size of the ocean and the limitations of underwater archaeology, this is not surprising. The absence of a wreck does not mean that the ships did not exist. It means the ocean is very large and very deep and keeps most of what it takes. The deliberate suppression of the voyages is, in its own way, one of the most consequential acts of institutional forgetting in human history. Not because it changed the course of the voyages themselves, which were already over, because it shaped what the world would know about them for centuries afterward. When European scholars began to piece together the history of the Indian Ocean world in the 18th and 19th centuries, it did so largely without knowledge of Zheng He's fleet. The voyages had happened, had been enormous, had been documented at the time, had then been so thoroughly buried by the political choices of Ming officials that they were invisible to the outside world for nearly 400 years. It was only in the 20th century as Chinese and Western historians began to work through surviving Ming records and cross-reference them with accounts from foreign sources that the full scale of what had happened began to come into focus. And what comes into focus when you look at all of it together is not just the voyages themselves, but the act of suppression. The burning of the charts, the rotting of the ships, the sea ban, the administrative decision to treat the greatest maritime achievement in the world's history as something that should be unmade and forgotten. That decision is as much a part of this story as the voyages themselves, perhaps more, because it raises a question that the voyages alone do not. Not what did China do, but why did China stop, and what did the stopping cost? That question, the question of what the voyages actually left behind and what the suppression took away, is where the story turns next. So the question becomes not just what was lost, but what actually remained. What did the voyages accomplish in the concrete, measurable sense before the suppression began and the ships were left to rot? Because the answer to that question is more substantial than the silence that followed might suggest. Over the course of the 7 voyages, spanning nearly 3 decades from 1405 to 1433, more than 30 countries sent tribute missions to the Ming court as a direct result of Zheng He's fleet. 30 countries. That is not a vague diplomatic gesture. That is a structured network of relationships, formalized through ceremony, gift exchange, and the acknowledgement of Ming authority as the organizing center of a very large world. Rulers from Malacca, Java, Calicut, Hormuz, Aden, Mogadishu, Bengal, dozens of other polities sent envoys to Nanjing, carrying local goods, animals, formal pledges of tributary relationship. The Yongle Emperor received them in his court, seated beneath the Great Hall of the Forbidden City, and distributed silk, porcelain, copper coins, and imperial patents of recognition in return. It was theatre, yes, it was also a functioning diplomatic system that connected China to the Indian Ocean world in a way that had not existed before. What travelled along that network was not only ceremony. The goods moved in both directions, and the range of what came back to China from the voyages was genuinely remarkable. Spices arrived from Java, Sumatra, and the Malabar coast of India. Pepper, cloves, nutmeg, cardamom, medicines and dyes from the Arab ports, ivory from East Africa, resins and aromatic woods from Southeast Asia, textiles from India, and of course the animals, giraffes and zebras, and lions and ostriches, that caused such a stir in Nanjing, because no one there had ever seen anything like them, and because their arrival could be interpreted, with a little creative official encouragement, as evidence of heaven's approval for the emperor's reign. In the other direction, Chinese goods moved outward along the same routes. Here the evidence is not just in the written records, it is in the ground. Archaeologists working along the East African coast have found Chinese porcelain at sites including Kilwa in Tanzania, at Mombasa, at Malindi, and at other Swahili coast settlements dating to the 15th century. Blue and white porcelain, celadon ware, the kind of Chinese ceramics that were produced in enormous quantities during the Ming period and that were, by any standard of the time, among the most refined manufactured goods in the world. Finding them in East Africa, in the soil of places that Zheng He's fleet actually visited, is one of those moments in archaeology where a written record and a physical object confirm each other across 500 years. Copper coins also travelled along these routes. Chinese copper cash, the small round coins with a square hole at the centre that formed the basis of everyday commerce in Ming China, been found at sites along the Indian Ocean rim. They were not only used as currency in China, they circulated as a medium of exchange across the maritime trade networks of Southeast Asia, where Chinese commercial influence had been building for centuries before Zheng He's fleet ever departed. The voyages intensified and formalized something that had already been developing slowly through generations of smaller-scale Chinese merchant activity, which brings up something worth pausing on because it is easy to misread what the voyages were. They were not a colonial enterprise in the sense that Portugal and Spain would later understand colonialism. Zheng He's fleet did not arrive in Calicut and claim it for the Ming Emperor. It did not establish plantations in Java or extract forced labour from the populations of East Africa. The tributary model was different in structure from the extractive commercial model that would define European expansion in the late 15th and 16th centuries. Ming court was not primarily interested in profit in the way a merchant company would be. It was interested in recognition, the acknowledgement by foreign rulers that the Yongli Emperor stood at the apex of the civilized world. The goods exchanged were the material expression of that relationship, not the primary purpose of the relationship itself. This distinction matters, though it should not be romanticized too heavily. The fleet did use military force when it needed to. Pirate Chen Zuyi was captured and executed. The king of Ceylon was brought to Nanjing in chains. Local rulers who resisted were dealt with. The tributary system was not a gentle suggestion. It was backed by the largest navy the world had ever seen, and everyone along the Indian Ocean rim understood that. The soft power and the hard power coexisted as they usually do, but the structural intent of the voyages was not to extract wealth from foreign populations in a sustained, institutionalized way. It was to demonstrate that the center of the world was in Nanjing, and to have that demonstration acknowledged. One of the more lasting concrete consequences of the voyages was the strengthening and formalization of Chinese diaspora communities in Southeast Asia, particularly in Malacca. Malacca was a young and strategically vital port on the Malay Peninsula, sitting at the narrow strait between the Malay Peninsula and Sumatra, through which virtually all maritime trade between the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea had to pass. The Yongle Emperor recognized its importance early. Zheng He's fleet visited Malacca on multiple voyages. The relationship between the Ming court and Malacca's rulers became one of the most durable diplomatic partnerships the voyages produced. Malacca accepted tributary status under Ming protection, which gave it a degree of security against its larger neighbours, and in return it became a reliable way station and resupply point for the fleet. Chinese merchants, sailors, and craftsmen had been settling in Malacca and other Southeast Asian ports for generations before the voyages, but the voyages gave those communities a new kind of official backing. The presence of Zheng He's fleet arriving in harbour with its red silk sails and its dozens of warships was a statement about who the Chinese residents of Malacca could call upon if they needed to. The communities that formed in these ports would endure long after the voyages ended and long after the Ming dynasty itself collapsed. The descendants of those early settlers are still there. Chinese communities of Malaysia and Indonesia today are in part the distant human legacy of a process that the Treasure Voyages accelerated and formalized. Geographic knowledge the voyages generated is harder to quantify because so much of it was deliberately destroyed. The navigation charts that Liu Daxia reportedly burned in the 1470s were not just records of where the fleet had been. They were working documents accumulated over 7 voyages and decades of Indian Ocean navigation, incorporating star charts, depth soundings, coastal profiles, wind patterns, the kind of practical knowledge that only comes from actually sailing a route repeatedly. Their loss was not only a cultural tragedy, it was the destruction of a body of technical knowledge that represented the combined experience of thousands of navigators and sailors across 30 years of voyaging. What survives is fragmentary. The Wu Beiji military encyclopedia, compiled in the early 17th century, contains a set of navigational charts that are believed to be derived from Zheng He's era. How faithfully they reproduce the originals is impossible to say. They show the routes from China to East Africa in a form that is schematic rather than cartographically precise by modern standards. They demonstrate that the fleet had a systematic understanding of the Indian Ocean that was far more detailed than anything available in Europe at the time. It is worth holding that comparison in mind for a moment. Vasco da Gama sailed into Calicut harbour in 1498, 65 years after Zheng He's last visit. He was arriving in a place that the Ming fleet had visited multiple times, had mapped, established formal diplomatic relations with, and had traded in extensively. Da Gama's pilot for the final leg of the voyage from the East African coast to India was an experienced Indian Ocean navigator, possibly Ahmad ibn Majid, an Arab sailor whose knowledge of those waters came from exactly the kind of accumulated maritime tradition that the Indian Ocean world had been building for centuries, a tradition that Zheng He's voyages had been part of. The Indian Ocean was not an unknown sea, it was a well-travelled one. What was new in 1498 was not the ocean or the destination, the identity of the arrivals, and the very different set of intentions they brought with them. The goods that the voyagers introduced to China also had effects that are difficult to trace precisely, but real nonetheless. Medicines and botanical knowledge arrived along with the spices and the textiles. Ma Huan, Muslim interpreter who sailed on several of the voyages and wrote an account called the Yingye Shenglan, the overall survey of the ocean's shores, recorded detailed observations of the plants, animals, customs, foods, and medical practices of the places the fleet visited. His account is one of the most valuable surviving primary sources from the voyages, and it reads like the work of a genuinely curious observer. It describes the preparation of foods in Java, the legal customs of Calicut, the physical appearance of the people of Hormuz, the animals of East Africa. It is not a dry administrative record. It is a document of encounter written by someone who was paying attention. Ma Huan's Yingye Shenglan, along with Fei Xin's Xingxia Shenglan, another account by a participant in the voyages, preserved a body of first-hand observation about the Indian Ocean world in the early 15th century that historians still rely on today. The spread of Islam in Southeast Asia is another area where the voyages played a role, though the relationship is complex, and the voyages were not the cause so much as a contributing factor. He himself was a Muslim, and several of his senior officers and interpreters were also Muslim. The fleet's presence in ports like Malacca and Sumatra, where Islam was already spreading through the existing merchant networks of Arab and Indian traders, gave a kind of visibility and legitimacy to the Muslim communities in those places. Whether this actively accelerated Islamization is debated by historians, but it is at minimum an interesting coincidence that several of the ports most closely associated with Zheng He's voyages were also among the earliest centers of Islam in Southeast Asia. What the voyages were not, this is worth saying plainly, was a missed opportunity for Chinese world domination in the way that popular accounts sometimes frame it. Framing tends to project European colonial ambitions backward onto a Chinese context where they did not quite fit. The Ming court did not stop the voyages because it lacked the capacity to continue them. It stopped them because the Confucian scholar official class that controlled imperial administration did not see any value in continuing them. The tributary model had achieved what it was designed to achieve. The Yongle emperor, who needed the voyages for political legitimacy, was dead. His successors did not share his ambitions or his needs. The voyages were expensive. They were ideologically uncomfortable to the Confucian worldview. And the northern frontier threatened by Mongol incursion seemed a more pressing concern than the Indian Ocean. Stopping was a choice made within a particular political and cultural context, not a failure of nerve or capacity. But choices have consequences, and the consequence of this one was that the knowledge, networks, and the institutional capacity that the voyagers had built were allowed to decay rather than develop. The Chinese diaspora communities in Southeast Asia continued to exist and to trade. They did so without official backing, without the fleet behind them, and increasingly in tension with the Haijin, the sea ban that restricted private maritime commerce. The Indian Ocean trade continued, it always had. But China's relationship to it changed from the center of a formal tributary network to a more ambiguous position, neither fully engaged nor fully withdrawn. What the voyagers left behind in the end is a combination of things. It is the porcelain in the East African soil. It is the stone inscriptions at Changle and Gali. It is the Chinese communities in Malacca and Semarang and a dozen other Southeast Asian cities. It is Ma Huan's careful observations of the world as it was in 1415 and 1421. It is the enormous rudder post in the ground at Nanjing, a piece of wood that tells you without any ambiguity how large the ships actually were. It is the diplomatic memory preserved in the records of the foreign courts that received the fleet, in the chronicles of Malacca, the accounts of Arab merchants who wrote about the Chinese ships arriving in Aden and Hormuz. The record is fragmentary, incomplete, and in places irreparably damaged by the suppression. But it is not nothing. It is enough to tell the story if you know where to look. And knowing where to look is exactly what archaeologists and historians have been doing slowly and carefully for the past century. Physical evidence they have found, and the limits of what they have not yet found, is where the story turns next. So let us start with the stone. In 1431, before the seventh and final voyage departed from the port of Changle in Fujian province, He and his officers did something that feels almost out of character for a man whose records were later so thoroughly destroyed. They carved an inscription into a stone stele and left it behind. Changle inscription, as it is now known, is one of the most important surviving primary sources from the entire history of the voyages. It was written in both Chinese and in a second stele found nearby in Tamil. The Chinese version records the history of the voyages in Zheng He's own voice, or at least in the official voice of his command. It lists the countries visited, describes the purpose of the missions, speaks with quiet pride about the reach of the fleet. It is not a modest document, but it is a factual one, and it has been studied carefully by historians since it was rediscovered in the 20th century. Stone itself still exists. It is housed today in the Changle Museum in Fujian, and it is, in a sense, the closest thing we have to Zheng He, speaking directly across 6 centuries. The Galais stele is the other major surviving inscription from the voyages, and it is in some ways even more remarkable. Found in 1911 near the port of Galais, on the southern coast of Sri Lanka, it was carved in 3 languages, Chinese, Tamil, and Persian. Each version addresses a different god, the Chinese text offering tribute to the Buddha, the Tamil text to a Hindu deity, the Persian text to Allah. It is dated to 1409, placing it during the 3rd voyage. What is striking about it is not just the multilingual nature of the inscription, which reflects the genuinely cosmopolitan character of the fleet and its crew, but the fact that it survived at all. Galais was a busy port. It was later occupied by the Portuguese, then the Dutch, then the British. The stone sat through centuries of colonial administration and was eventually incorporated into a wall before being identified and removed for study. It now sits in the Colombo National Museum in Sri Lanka. A British colonial surveyor who found it initially had no idea what it was. It took scholars some time to work out its full significance. It's a stone carved on behalf of a Chinese admiral in 1409, ended up embedded in a wall in a British colonial port, is the kind of historical accident that makes you realize how much of the past survives purely by chance. There is also a stele associated with the voyages at Liujiagang, near the mouth of the Yangtze River in Jiangsu province, which served as one of the fleet's departure points. The Liujiagang inscription, like the Chang'e one, was set up before the 7th voyage and records some of the same historical information. Together, the Chang'e and Liujiagang stelae form a kind of paired official record, the last act of documentation before a voyage from which Zheng He would not return. Beyond the inscriptions, the most widely distributed physical evidence of the voyages is Chinese porcelain. This is not a dramatic find in the way that a shipwreck would be, but it is steady and consistent, and it turns up in exactly the places the historical record says the fleet visited. Along the East African coast, archaeologists have been finding Chinese porcelain for well over a century. At Kilwa, the great Swahili trading city, on the coast of what is now Tanzania, excavations have uncovered Chinese ceramics dating from the Song dynasty through the Ming period. Kilwa was one of the wealthiest cities in sub-Saharan Africa in the 14th and 15th centuries. Its trade connections extended across the Indian Ocean. The porcelain found there is not all from the Yongle and Xuande periods specifically, because Chinese ceramics have been reaching East Africa through Arab intermediaries long before the treasure fleet arrived. But the Ming period pieces, particularly the blue and white porcelain characteristic of the Yongle and Xuande reigns, fit the timeline of the voyages closely. At Mombasa, at Malindi, at Zanzibar, similar pieces have been found. The pattern is consistent enough that the porcelain functions as a kind of material trail, not proof of a specific ship's presence at a specific moment, confirmation that the Chinese world and the East African world were genuinely connected during this period. In 2010, a Kenyan-Chinese archaeological team began excavating at Mambrui, a site near Malindi on the Kenyan coast. They found fragments of Chinese porcelain, as expected, but they also found something more unusual, a Chinese copper coin dating to the early 15th century. Copper coins were used as small denomination currency across the Indian Ocean world, and Chinese coins had been circulating in East Africa for some time before the voyages. But the presence of early Ming coins at a site closely associated with the fleet's documented visits adds another small piece to the picture. In 2013, the same team announced the discovery of what appeared to be a fragment of a Chinese storage jar at a site in Lamu County, along with other ceramic material. The work is ongoing, and the findings are not dramatic enough to rewrite the historical record. They are the kind of quiet accumulation of evidence that gives historians confidence that the documentary sources are telling the truth. The most physically striking piece of evidence, though, is not in East Africa or Sri Lanka. It is in Nanjing, at the site of the Longjiang shipyard, where the treasure fleet was built. 1962, during construction work near the old shipyard on the Qinhuai River, workers uncovered an enormous wooden object buried in the ground. It was a rudder post, and when it was measured, it was found to be approximately 11 meters long. 11 meters, to give that some scale, the entire length of a typical London double-decker bus is around 11 meters. This was not the rudder itself, which would have been even larger, the post around which the rudder pivoted. For a ship to require a rudder post of that size, the vessel would need to be very large indeed. The dimensions are consistent with the Baochuan treasure ships described in the historical sources as being roughly 137 meters long and 55 meters wide. For a long time, some historians argued that those dimensions were exaggerated, the sources were inflated by imperial pride or later embellishment. The rudder post does not prove the exact measurements, but it makes the general scale of the ships much harder to dismiss. Something that needed an 11 rudder post was not a small vessel. The post is now preserved and on display at the Nanjing Treasure Boat Shipyard Site Museum, which was established on the location of the original Longjiang shipyard. You can go and see it. It is a straightforward piece of wood, and it is enormous. Underwater archaeology in the South China Sea has also contributed to the picture, though more indirectly. Numerous shipwrecks have been found in the waters between China and Southeast Asia, some carrying cargoes of Ming porcelain and other goods consistent with the early 15th century. The Nanhai 1, a Song dynasty merchant ship raised from the seabed off Guangdong province, is now housed in a specially built museum, is not from the Zheng He period, but it demonstrates the scale and sophistication of Chinese maritime trade in the centuries before the Treasure Voyages. Other wrecks, less completely excavated, have been found in the waters around the Philippines, Indonesia, and the Malay Peninsula. None of them are confirmed treasure ships. The Baochuan themselves have not been found. No wreck has been definitively identified as one of the great 9-masted vessels that sailed under Zheng He's command, and given the way the fleet ended, rotting at the docks rather than sinking at sea, this is perhaps not surprising. Ships that are left to decay on land do not leave the kind of preserved wreck that underwater conditions can sometimes produce. The wood rots, the iron rusts, materials are scavenged and reused. What remains is fragments, impressions, the shapes of things, rather than the things themselves. There is one more category of physical evidence worth mentioning, and it is the kind often overlooked in favour of more dramatic finds. It is the evidence preserved in the foreign records of the countries the fleet visited. The Chronicles of Malacca, written in Malay, record the arrival of the Chinese fleet and the establishment of diplomatic relations with the Ming court. Javanese Pararaton and other Southeast Asian texts mention Chinese visitors and Chinese political influence during the early 15th century. Arab geographers and merchants wrote about the Chinese ships in the ports of Aden and Hormuz. The Moroccan traveller Ibn Battuta, who visited many of the same Indian Ocean ports in the 14th century, described the Chinese junks he encountered as the largest ships he had ever seen. Though his visits predated the treasure fleet by several decades, they give a sense of the reputation that Chinese maritime activity had already established. The Ethiopian chronicles mention a Chinese embassy arriving at the court of the Negus in the early 15th century. Not all of these references can be definitively linked to Zheng He's specific voyages, but taken together, they form a consistent picture of Chinese maritime presence in the Indian Ocean world during exactly the period in question. What has not been found is, in its own way, equally informative. Navigation charts that Liu Daxia reportedly burned in the 1470s have never been recovered. There are no surviving copies, no fragments, no partial reproductions from the period. The Mao Kun map, nautical chart published in a military encyclopedia in 1621, is sometimes cited as a possible derivative of the original Zheng He charts. It does show routes through the South China Sea and Indian Ocean consistent with the voyages. But it is a later compilation. Whether it preserves material from the original charts or represents an independent reconstruction is not fully established. The logbooks and detailed sailing records that a fleet of that size would have generated are gone. The administrative records of the treasure fleet's operations, the supply manifests, the diplomatic correspondence, personnel rosters, most of it was either deliberately destroyed or simply lost in the ordinary attrition of time and institutional neglect. What survived did so, almost accidentally, through the inscriptions carved in stone, the accounts written by individual participants like Ma Huan and Fei Xin, the porcelain left in the ground at foreign ports, the records kept by the foreign courts that received the fleet's envoys. The limits of the physical record are real, and they matter. They mean that certain questions about the voyages cannot be answered with confidence. We do not know the exact dimensions of the treasure ships, only that they were very large. We do not know the precise routes taken on each voyage, only the general outlines. We do not know exactly what Zheng He himself thought about the voyages, and what he believed their purpose was beyond the official diplomatic mission, or what he made of the places he visited. Ma Huan gives us the observations of a curious and intelligent man who was present for several of the voyages. But Ma Huan was an interpreter, not the admiral. The inner life of Zheng He himself remains largely inaccessible. What is accessible is the pattern, and the pattern assembled from the stone inscriptions, the foreign chronicles, the porcelain in the soil, the 11 rudder post in Nanjing, and the careful accounts of the men who sailed, is consistent and coherent. The voyages happened. They reached the places the sources say they reached. The fleet was as large and as organized as the documents claim. The diplomatic system it operated within was real and had lasting effects. The physical evidence does not prove every detail of every account. It confirms the essential shape of the story in enough places that the story holds. There is something quietly satisfying about that, actually. History this large and this old is rarely confirmed cleanly. The evidence comes in pieces, from different directions, in different languages, in different forms. A stone in a museum in Fujian, a stele in Colombo, a shard of blue and white porcelain in the soil of a Kenyan coast site, a wooden post that once helped steer a ship the size of a football pitch. Each piece by itself is incomplete. Together they form something you can trust. The physical record also has one more function, beyond simply confirming what happened. It points toward what was lost. Every piece of evidence that survived the suppression of the records is a reminder that there was once far more. Stele at Changle survived because it was carved in stone and left in a provincial port far from the political centre where the destruction of records was ordered. The porcelain in East Africa survived because it was already on the other side of the world when the Confucian officials were ordering the fleet mothballed and the charts burned. The rudder post survived because it was buried in the ground, invisible to the men who were dismantling everything else. The survival of evidence in this story is almost always accidental. The destruction was deliberate. That asymmetry between the systematic effort to erase and the random chance that preserved scraps and fragments shapes everything about how we understand the voyages today. It also raises a question that the physical evidence alone cannot answer. Not what happened, but why. Why did a civilization capable of building those ships, sailing those distances, establishing those diplomatic networks choose to stop, dismantle what it had built, and turn away from the ocean entirely? The porcelain in the soil at Kilwa cannot tell you that. The rudder post in Nanjing cannot tell you that. For that, you have to look not at what was found, but at what was chosen. And that is a question about politics, philosophy, economics, the particular shape of the Ming dynasty's relationship to the world it had briefly reached out to touch. And that question, once you sit with it, turns out to be one of the most interesting things about the entire story. Not the ships, not the distances, not the giraffes or the battles or the stone inscriptions. The most interesting thing is the stopping, because the stopping was not forced. China was not invaded. The fleet was not destroyed by a storm. The empire did not collapse. The decision to end the voyages, dismantle the ships, turn away from the ocean was made by people who had every resource available to continue. They chose not to, and understanding why they made that choice tells you something important about how civilizations work, about what drives expansion and what stops it, and about the particular logic of a world that looked very different from the one that was about to emerge in Europe. Modern China Zheng He became something close to a national symbol, and the transformation was deliberate and significant. By the late 20th century, China was re-engaging with the world after decades of relative isolation. The story of the Treasure Voyages offered something politically useful and historically genuine at the same time. Here was proof, carved into stone and written in the records that survived, that China had once projected extraordinary power across the Indian Ocean, that it had done so peacefully, at least by the standards of the age, that it had reached East Africa and the Persian Gulf and the Malabar coast centuries before European ships arrived. The voyages became a way of saying that China's engagement with the wider world was not a recent imitation of Western behavior, but a deep tradition with ancient roots. The 600th anniversary of the first voyage in 2005 was marked in China with considerable ceremony. Stamps were issued, documentaries were produced, replica ships were constructed, including a large-scale model of a Baochuan that toured ports and generated attention both domestically and internationally. The date of Zheng He's first departure, the 11th of July, officially designated China's Maritime Day, a national observance that tied modern China's maritime ambitions directly to the memory of the admiral who had sailed 7 centuries before. Schools taught his story, or museums dedicated exhibitions to his voyages. His image appeared on everything from commemorative coins to educational posters. The revival was thorough and enthusiastic. It carried a clear message about how China understood its own place in the world. Some historians noted gently but honestly that the official celebration of Zheng He involved a degree of selective memory. The voyages were presented primarily as peaceful diplomatic missions, which in many respects they were. But the fleet also fought battles, deposed rulers, and transported captive kings to Nanjing in chains. The conquest of Ceylon, the destruction of Chen Zuyi's pirate forces, the installation of compliant rulers in places where less cooperative ones had been removed. These were real parts of the story too. A fleet of 300 ships carrying nearly 30,000 men was not simply a floating gift exchange. It carried the implicit and sometimes explicit threat of overwhelming force. It does not make the voyages villainous by the standards of their time. But it does complicate the image of purely benevolent maritime diplomacy that some modern presentations preferred. The voyages were both genuinely remarkable and politically complex, as most large historical events tend to be. Still, the revival of Zheng He's memory in China was not purely manufactured. It was a real historical substance to build on, and the popular fascination with his story was genuine. People found it genuinely astonishing that this had happened, that China had assembled the largest fleet in history, sailed it to the edge of the known world, and then chosen to forget about it. That combination of extraordinary achievement and deliberate abandonment gave the story a quality that purely triumphant histories lack. There was something melancholy in it, something that invited reflection rather than just celebration. And that quality, the mix of wonder and loss, made it compelling in a way that simple propaganda rarely manages to be. Outside China, Zheng He's legacy had a different texture. In Southeast Asia, particularly in Malaysia and Indonesia, his memory had never entirely faded. Chinese diaspora communities in these regions had maintained their own traditions, connecting their presence and their history to the voyages of the treasure fleet. In Semarang, the northern coast of Java in Indonesia, the Sam Pokong Temple stands as one of the most vivid surviving expressions of this memory. The temple, also known as Gedung Batu, is dedicated to Zheng He himself, venerated there not as a historical figure in the academic sense, but as a protective deity, a divine presence associated with safe voyages and good fortune. The site draws hundreds of thousands of visitors each year, particularly during the annual festival that commemorates Zheng He's arrival on the Javanese coast. The festival involves elaborate processions, offerings, music, and ceremony that blend Chinese, Javanese, and Islamic traditions in ways that reflect the genuinely mixed cultural history of the region. Similar temples and shrines associated with Zheng He exist in Malacca, in Penang, in parts of Thailand and the Philippines. These places, the admiral became something that official Chinese history never quite made him: a folk saint, a protector, a figure embedded in the daily religious life of communities that have been shaped in part by the world his voyages helped create. The Chinese diaspora communities of Southeast Asia, the Peranakan Chinese of Malacca, Hokkien merchants of Penang, the communities of Fujian descent scattered across the Indonesian archipelago, all carried layers of connection to the maritime world that Zheng He had moved through. For them, his memory was not a political project, it was simply part of who they were. In the Muslim world, Zheng He's identity as a Hui Muslim added another dimension to his legacy. The fact that the man who commanded China's greatest fleet was himself a Muslim, the son and grandson of men who had made the Hajj to Mecca, was a detail that resonated across communities from the Middle East to Southeast Asia. Some accounts suggest that Zheng He himself visited Mecca during the 7th voyage, or that his deputy Hong Bao travelled there on his behalf. The evidence for this is not conclusive, but the possibility was meaningful. It placed the Chinese admiral within the global community of Islamic civilization, connected him to the pilgrimage routes and the trading networks, the intellectual culture that linked Mecca to Malacca to Mogadishu. In some tellings, Zheng He became a figure who embodied the possibility of a world where Chinese power and Islamic faith were not in opposition. The largest fleet in history could sail under the command of a man who prayed 5 times a day and whose family had walked the roads to the holy city. Then there is the controversy that for a period in the early 2000s managed to overshadow much of the serious historical discussion about the voyages entirely. In 2002, British amateur historian named Gavin Menzies published a book called 1421, The Year China Discovered America. The title alone was enough to guarantee attention. Menzies argued that Zheng He's fleets had not only reached the Persian Gulf and East Africa, but had sailed around the Cape of Good Hope, crossed the Atlantic, reached the Americas, circumnavigated the globe, and mapped the world decades before any European explorer had done any of those things. He claimed that Chinese sailors had landed in North America, South America, Australia, and Antarctica. He argued that the maps Columbus used were derived from Chinese originals. He suggested that evidence of Chinese presence could be found in genetic traces among indigenous populations, in old maps, architectural remains, and in a variety of other sources scattered across the globe. The book sold millions of copies. It was translated into dozens of languages. It generated television documentaries, newspaper features, and a great deal of excited public discussion. For a certain kind of reader, it offered exactly the kind of revisionist history that felt thrilling, a story in which the conventional narrative was turned upside down, in which the Europeans were not the first, but the second, or third, or fourth, in which the real pioneers had been Chinese and Muslim, had sailed in ships 4 times the size of anything Columbus commanded. Professional historians, however, were nearly unanimous in their rejection of Menzies' central claims. The criticism was not gentle. Scholars of Chinese history, maritime history, cartography, and archaeology pointed out that the book's methodology was deeply flawed. Menzies treated speculation as evidence, ignored contrary sources, misread maps, misidentified artifacts, and constructed elaborate chains of inference from premises that were themselves unverified. The Chinese records that survived from the voyages, limited as they are, do not support the routes he described. The navigational technology of the period, while impressive, was not sufficient for the circumnavigation he proposed. The genetic and archaeological evidence he cited was either misinterpreted or did not say what he claimed it said. Maps he pointed to as proof of Chinese cartographic priority, had been examined by specialists who found his readings unconvincing. What made the controversy particularly frustrating for serious historians was that it threatened to contaminate the genuine wonder of the actual voyages. The real story of Zheng He did not need embellishment. A fleet of 300 ships reaching East Africa in the early 15th century was astonishing enough on its own terms. The actual documented reach of the voyages, from the South China Sea to the Persian Gulf to the Swahili coast, was a genuine historical achievement of the first order. The diplomatic networks, the exchange of goods and animals and knowledge, the navigational sophistication, the organizational complexity of supplying nearly 30,000 men at sea, all of this was real, documented, and extraordinary. Replacing that reality with a fantasy of global circumnavigation did not honor Zheng He, it obscured him. Zheng He himself remains, in the end, a figure who is easier to admire than to fully know. He left almost no personal record. The inscriptions at Chang'an speak of the voyages in the language of official commemoration, not personal reflection. We do not know what he thought about the places he saw, what he made of the giraffes and the ostriches and the foreign kings, what it felt like to stand at the prow of a Bao somewhere off the East African coast, and look at a coastline that no Chinese admiral had ever seen before. We do not know how he felt about his own history, about the capture and the castration, and the long road from a boy taken from Yunnan to the most powerful admiral in the world. He did not leave us those thoughts. What he left was the voyages themselves, the physical fact of having gone, the trails of porcelain and diplomatic memory and temple incense that mark his passage across the Indian Ocean world. And perhaps that is fitting in a way. The voyages were always larger than the man, even as the man was extraordinary. They were a product of a particular emperor's ambition, a particular moment in Chinese history, a particular configuration of political will and organizational capacity and navigational knowledge that came together briefly and then dissolved. Zheng He was the instrument of that moment, and a remarkable one. The story belongs to more than him. It belongs to the 30,000 men who sailed with him, whose names are mostly lost. It belongs to the craftsmen who built the ships at Longjiang. It belongs to the communities along the Swahili coast and the Malabar coast and the Strait of Malacca who watched the fleet arrive and conducted their own negotiations and sent their own envoys back to Nanjing. It belongs to the Confucian officials who ended the voyages, and to the emperor who ordered the last one, and to the minor official who reportedly burned the charts, and to all the people in between who made decisions that shaped what the voyages became and what they failed to become. The story of the treasure fleet is not a simple story of greatness and loss, though it contains both. It is a story about what civilizations choose to do with their capabilities and what they choose not to do, and how those choices echo forward in ways that the people making them could not have foreseen. It is a story about the gap between what is possible and what is pursued, about the way that extraordinary things can be created and then deliberately unmade, about the strange fact that the greatest fleet in history left so little physical trace precisely because the society that built it later decided it should not be remembered. It is a story that is still being told, still being debated, still being claimed and contested and rediscovered, which suggests that whatever the Confucian officials intended when they burned those charts, they did not entirely succeed. The ocean remembers even when the records do not. There is a small museum near Nanjing, not far from where the Longjiang shipyard once stood, where the ground has been carefully excavated, and a few artifacts placed behind glass. It is not a grand place. It does not draw the kind of crowds that the Forbidden City draws, or the kind of reverence that attaches itself to older, more visible monuments. But if you visit, and if you walk quietly through the exhibits, you will come to a particular object that tends to stop people. It is a stone anchor, heavy, plain, worn smooth by time. It does not look like much. It looks like a rock. When you understand what it is and what it once held in place, something in the mind shifts slightly. Because this is what remains of the greatest fleet in history, a stone anchor, few inscriptions carved into hillsides, sherds of porcelain turning up in the soil of East African ports, a rudder post 11 meters, long pulled from the mud near Nanjing, too large to belong to any ordinary ship, the tomb of Zheng He himself, a modest structure on a hillside outside the city, where the man who commanded 30,000 sailors across the Indian Ocean was laid to rest in a place so quiet. You can hear the wind move through the trees. There is something in that quietness that feels worth sitting with for a moment, not because it is sad, exactly, though it carries a certain spite weight, but because it says something true about how history actually works. We tend to imagine that great things leave great traces. The scale of an achievement corresponds somehow to the scale of its monument. And sometimes that is true, but sometimes the opposite happens. Sometimes the greatest things leave the smallest marks, not by accident, by design. The deliberate burning of Zheng He's navigation charts, the mothballing of the ships, the Haijin sea ban, the official silence that settled over the voyages for centuries, all of that was a choice, a civilizational choice made by real people with real reasons, and it worked. For a long time, it worked almost completely. The stone anchor in the Nanjing Museum, the stelae at Changal and Gale, porcelain in the soil at Kilwa and Mombasa, the inscription carved into the hillside at Fujian in 1431, where Zheng He recorded what the voyagers had done. These are not much given the scale of what they represent. They are real. They are the physical residue of something that actually happened, and their very scarcity is part of their meaning. They survived the burning and the silence and the centuries, precisely because they were stone and clay and fired earth, materials that do not burn as easily as paper and wood and silk. The ocean itself is perhaps the most honest archive of all. The South China Sea that the fleet crossed on every departure, the Indian Ocean that carried the ships to Calicut and Hormuz, and the East African coast, the waters off Malacca, where the first great battle was fought, none of that has changed. The same stars that Zheng He's navigators used to plot their course are still there on a clear night, still in the same positions relative to the horizon, still the same points of reference that guided 30,000 men across water that most of the world did not yet know how to read. When you look at the sky from the deck of a ship at night, somewhere in the South China Sea or the Indian Ocean, you're looking at what Zheng He looked at. The stars do not keep records, but they do not forget either. Sleep well, wherever you are, and thank you, as always, for spending this quiet time with Abyssal Zenith. If the story found you tonight, I hope it stays with you gently. Please do like the video if it meant something to you, and subscribe if you would like to find more of these slow, careful journeys into the world's most extraordinary corners. There is always more to explore. We will always take our time getting there.